Sicily lay where three seas argue, and merchants have been counting coins since before there were calendars. In July 1943, it became the place where an alliance tested its balance. Operation Husky landed British 8th Army along the island's southeast, near Pacino and Syracuse, and American 7th Army along the south-central beaches at Gela, Licata and Scogliti. The plan was simple enough to draw with a finger and complex enough to go wrong in a dozen ways. Wind scattered some of the paratroopers like dice thrown on a stone floor. Surf shoved landing craft sideways. At Gela, tanks tried to climb out of water while German counterattacks came down the only roads that mattered. The first hours were not elegant. Elegance was never the point. Frank DeLuca stepped out of a landing craft and into surf that tasted like a kitchen's spilled salt. The sand looked like home until the first artillery round reminded him that no sand is friendly under that sound. He ran because everyone ran and because there's a physics to a beach landing. Momentum is half the tactic. German tanks nosed down the road and found American bazookas that misbehaved and men who made up for it with angles and grenades. Naval guns reached from offshore, dragging the weight of steel into the fight with shells that lifted sand into the sky as if to erase the morning and start again. When the smoke settled, the beachhead still belonged to the men who had come ashore, and that was the only definition of success that mattered. The island itself taught a different geography lesson every 5 miles. Eastward, the road to Catania tightened between Mount Etna's shoulder and the sea, a defile made for delaying actions. Montgomery's columns found themselves grinding forward while German paratroops and grenadiers set ambushes with a miser's patience. Westward and north, the American march loosened, pivoting toward Palermo with a tempo that surprised even its authors. Ports fell like doors that hadn't been locked properly. Sicilian towns, with balconies, oranges, saint statues in niches, and cats that did not startle at gunfire, watched two armies that spoke different English argue quietly over who was supposed to take which road. Coalition war is choreography and compromise. Sicily wrote that into the dust. Jack Torres's destroyer guarded convoys that looked, from a distance, like a moving city. The Mediterranean summer made everything too bright. U-boats still hunted, but aircraft hunted them in return, and the sea felt less like an enemy highway with each passing week. Off Gela, Jack sat at his set while the ship's 5-inch guns spoke to counterattacks ashore. He relayed bearings, copied clipped requests from spotters, and felt the strange intimacy of gunnery support, killing at the request of a voice that never told you his name. In a spare minute, he looked toward shore and saw a rising column of dust that had to be tanks, then watched it fold under fire, and he told himself to remember the sound, not the sight, because memory weighs less in the head when it's just sound. By late July, the Axis was leaving more boot prints than orders. Palermo fell and fed the Allied logistics machine with its keys and cranes. The race to Messina, wreathed in a media drama that would last longer than the distance deserved, ended with the Germans slipping across the strait in good order because they were good at slipping when it mattered, and because artillery can be as persuasive in retreat as in advance. None of that changed the arithmetic. Sicily had been a fortress on paper. In practice, it had been a test passed with corrections in the margins. It handed the Allies airfields at Gerbini and Palermo and a staging ground for the next argument with geography, the Italian mainland. The decision to cross came not only from maps, but from politics. On July 25th, as Allied troops were still dusting Sicily from their boots, Mussolini's own party elders stripped him of power. The king dismissed him. A marshal who spoke in careful sentences, Badoglio, took the microphone and told the country that everything had changed. And nothing had changed. Italy would continue the war, he said, but not for long, and not with the same allies. In secret, emissaries reached for an armistice with the Allies. In public, German units moved like a hedge planted overnight, preparing to disarm their former partners the instant the words became official. The ground to be fought over was not only fields and roads, it was allegiance. American and British landing craft nosed toward Calabria and Salerno in September. The Italian armistice would be announced on September 8th. Operation Baytown and Avalanche had been scheduled as if timing were a polite dinner invitation. War does not respect RSVP cards. At Salerno, the beaches curved like a smile that hid teeth. The land beyond was a shallow bowl edged by hills, and the Germans positioned their artillery the way a careful chef arranges knives. Surprise did not arrive. The first day ashore cost heavily. German counterattacks bit deep enough to show bone. There is a photograph from that week of men crouched behind low stone walls under a sky too blue for the sounds it carried. You can almost read the thought on one soldier's face. How do you learn this fast enough? Frank learned because his sergeant stood up when standing up looked like a bad idea and pointed. There. He learned to love naval gunfire like a god who answers on the first prayer. The battleships offshore, Texas, Nevada, threw shells the size of small domestic arguments into hillside orchards and made room to breathe. At one point, the line looked as if it would fold back into the sea. Brigades contracted and expanded like a lung with asthma. Tanks crawled around vineyards while infantry fought through ditches where water and fear lived together. The air filled with fighter bombers that stitched roads and hedgerows. A new kind of punctuation the Germans had to read, whether they liked the grammar or not. Jack's destroyer moved close enough to the beach that the sound of rifles came across water between the heavy booms. He passed fire missions as fast as the talkers could talk. Add 100, drop 50, write 2. The gunnery officer repeated numbers in a rhythm that made them human. And then, in a pause, a quiet came over the circuit. Then another request, then another explosion on the hills, then a cheer across the radio that sounded like a man forgetting the weight on his back for a second. The line held. The bowl emptied of enemies. Naples lay up the road, warehouses and rail yards waiting to be claimed and repaired and put to work. Naples offered fire and hunger as a welcome. The port had been bombed into practice rubble. The people had starved long enough to develop a way of moving that did not waste calories. The Allied engineers who turned to and made quays out of scorched concrete learned that logistics in Italy would always be a two-language conversation, material and human need. Naples also gave a gift that would matter beyond the city, airfields for the 15th Air Force and bases that opened the long ladder of the air war, marshalling yards in northern Italy, the Brenner Pass, Vienna's factories, oil in the Balkans. Bombs do not win alone, nothing does. But in the winter to come, American and British air power would batter the German arteries feeding the peninsula until every truck that tried to climb the Apennines felt old by the third mile. The march north began under skies that preferred grey. The maps named river lines like a poem, Volturno, Garigliano, Rapido. But the poem's meter was mud. The Germans, 10th Army, 14th Army, Kesselring orchestrating with a conductor's economy, built a series of defensive belts across the narrow waist of the peninsula. The Winter Line, later remembered by one of its keystones, the Gustav, ran from sea to sea, anchored on a mountain crowned by an abbey older than almost every idea the combatants carried into it. Monte Cassino sat above the Liri Valley like a thought you cannot ignore. The road to Rome ran under its gaze. The soft underbelly was all bone. Men said it in mess lines and wrote it home on postcards, half in jest and half in injury. Churchill's phrase, meant to sell a strategy, met granite and river, and an enemy good at choosing ground. The first attempts to force the valley and breach the line came in winter cold that punished hands and hearts. The Rapido River, shallow, fast, treacherous, ate assault boats and men together. Units attempted crossings under artillery that sounded like an argument ending in a slam door. Some crossings succeeded tactically and failed strategically because the position beyond offered no room to live. Others failed in both ways, and the casualty lists carried whole towns with them. At Cassino itself, the struggle became a treatise on modern war's paradoxes. The abbey, a Benedictine sanctuary, stood above the battlefield. The Germans swore not to occupy it. Allied troops below saw every muzzle flash near it as evidence that they had. Bombs eventually fell on the monastery, tons of explosive that turned stone into dust, but could not turn a mountainside into a gift. The rubble argued on the defenders' behalf. New attackers, New Zealanders, Indians, Brits, Americans, Poles, took turns at the slopes like climbers sharing ropes on a face that kept shedding them. In the town, street fighting broke buildings into facts, and men into the particular friends you remember forever. Ben Carter flew from airfields around Foggia, where the wind had a habit of shifting without asking. He learned the long run to targets across the Alps' shadow and the short, bruising hops to strike roads and bridges feeding Cassino. In briefings, he traced routes to rail yards named like spells: Verona, Bologna, Florence. Over the Liri, he watched columns scatter under rockets and then reform because discipline can live even when death is close. He saw the monastery after the bombs, a wound on a hill, and felt complicated. He understood that high ground is a weapon. He also understood that destruction does not always mean decision. He flew home once with flak holes you could put a fist through and, climbing out of the cockpit, touched the punctures like a believer touching a relic. In January 1944, while the line heaved and held, the Allies opened a second door behind the defenders' backs. Operation Shingle put a force ashore at Anzio, south of Rome, but north of the winter line. Behind it in theory, inside it in practice. Surprise, that rare coin was achieved. Exploitation, the thing surprise is meant to buy, did not arrive quickly enough. The beachhead broadened, then paused. German reaction was not an afterthought, it was a reflex. Divisions converged like dogs called from different yards. The flat ground behind the dunes became a bowl of artillery fire. The men in it learned new vocabularies of fear. Anzio Annie, a long-range railway gun, sent shells that you could hear travelling, the kind where sound arrives before explanation. Fields turned to hospitals, then back into fields, then into cemeteries without anyone planning those transitions. Frank lived in holes at Anzio that he and his friends improved with the same care a man gives a kitchen. He learned the exact depth of safety: 6 feet if the shell angle is wrong, 8 if the angle changes, 10 if you want to sleep as if sleep were possible. Mud crept into everything, and water into boots is not a metaphor. He learned to measure a day by cigarettes smoked and by the number of times he had to pretend he wasn't afraid, so that the new guy would keep eating. Letters arrived damp and were read and reread until the paper thinned. When counterattacks came, they looked like the end of everything and then weren't, and then the next day looked like the same end again. Time at Anzio became a shape with no corners, only edges. Jack's ship took station offshore and became a fist that punched inland when a radio told it where to aim. He heard on his net an artillery observer whose voice always sounded as if he were smiling, even when he was spelling coordinates like a prayer. The ship's guns barked through nights when the horizon was a line of small, constant storms. Once, a German bomber came in low, and the Oerlikons chattered with a panic that felt controlled. It passed, dropped nothing, and left behind the knowledge that even a quiet night is only a night that hasn't been chosen yet. Back in Washington, Anna Miller's pencil spent the Anzio weeks twice as fast. The cables purchased by Blood came in thicker where the line was thinnest. She moved them with a guilt that never left, the knowledge that any delay, one misfile, one misaddress, could tug at a thread that held someone's life. She had a map on her wall with pins for Salerno, Naples, Cassino, Anzio. She stared at the stretch of road between the beachhead and Rome and thought, not for the first time, how short distances can be the longest in the world. Aiko read the newspapers, and the word Anzio began to steal into headlines on days that should have gone to the Pacific. She felt the tug of two oceans in the way the country arranged its attention. This week, Sicily and Cassino. Next week, Kwajalein. The week after, the bomber war. In the camps far from any port, families with Italian surnames and families with Japanese surnames followed the news with the same hunger. Will this nightmare end sooner because of this? She typed orders for units bound for Europe and saved clippings that would make sense later or never. The political story intertwined with the military like vines on a wall. The armistice had been announced on September 8th. The Germans had executed their plan immediately, disarming Italian units by trick and by force, occupying the peninsula north of Naples, rescuing Mussolini from his captors and crowning him in a puppet capital at Salò. The king and Badoglio had scurried south, their authority trailing like a coat snagged on a fence. In the occupied north, the new Italian Social Republic waved a flag that many citizens refused to salute. Partisans chose the mountains and the alleys over the uniforms offered. In Rome for a time, the city lived under a hush that contained all possible futures at once. Air power punished the German choice to stay. From Foggia's sprawling complexes and from fields around Naples and later the Rome plain, American and British bombers and fighter bombers took up the work of interdiction and disruption. Operation Strangle sounds clinical in retrospect. At the time it meant junctions ripped apart, bridges folded into rivers, truck parks turned to stiffness under heat. Ben flew missions that felt repetitive until he saw a moving column scatter and knew repetition is the price of success. He learned that flak gunners in Italian towns could be both accurate and unlucky, and that each mission you came home from was statistically improbable and morally clarifying. The air war over Italy did not deliver a single day you could frame as decisive. It delivered a fatigue that rolled down on the German supply chain like weather. In May 1944, after months of learning and bleeding, the Allies pressed all fingers on the same point. Operation Diadem, a concerted blow along the Gothic Line intended to crack the door to Rome. British 8th Army pushed up the Liri Valley. French Expeditionary Corps, Moroccans who had learned to read mountains as if poverty had been training, slid through the Arunzi Hills where staff officers had frowned and written difficult. Polish II Corps attacked the wrecked Abbey Heights with a solemnity that later left cemeteries across the slope with markers that still face the sunrise. American divisions braced and pushed along the Garigliano. Artillery, never absent, wrote its testimony in a flat thunder that rolled hours into a single sound. When the breach came, it felt inevitable, the way patience often does in hindsight. The plan said the Anzio force, once released, should drive north to Valmontone and cut Highway 6, the escape route for the German 10th Army retreating from Cassino. The reality, once frontline commanders faced opportunity and risk, bent. The beachhead force pivoted west, toward Rome itself, drawn by the city's magnetism and by the logic that a liberated capital would mean something that a cut road could not. The German 10th Army slipped away, pounded, wounded, not destroyed. Historians would argue the point longer than the war lasted. Soldiers, for the most part, were too busy walking. Frank's boots entered Rome under an arch older than his family name. Civilians leaned out of windows and reached down with bread and wine and flowers as if generosity were a defense mechanism. American MPs tried to keep convoy discipline on streets where everything wanted to turn into a parade. The city's stones carried fewer scars than its people. On June 4, 1944, Rome became the first Axis capital to fall, and for 2 days the world stared. On June 6th, the world stared at Normandy. The timing was a thief and a reprieve. Rome would not become a strategic obsession. It would remain a moral waypoint. The men who had earned the entrance read the headlines from France without bitterness and with a private nod. The war had many fronts. Pride does not feed a man. Jack anchored off the coast when news of Rome ran like a good rumour through the fleet. He smoked and watched a sunset that had the decency to look ordinary. He thought of the folders in Anna's office, which he had never seen, and of trucks on the Leary Road, which he had also never seen, and he took comfort in the fact that war depends on invisible threads. The long climb was not over. North of Rome, the Apennines rose again, and behind them the Gothic Line drew itself across maps from the Ligurian Sea to the Adriatic. It was a fortification belt bounced across ridges, river lines, and towns with names that looked like poetry when written on envelopes. The summer saw Allied columns shove through Arezzo and Florence on the west, Ancona on the east, then stall again under weather and shortages and an enemy that never forgot how to move backward while still massing an unpleasant punch. The Gothic Line in the late summer and fall of 1944 was less famous than the Gustav, but not gentler. It taught one more set of lessons no one wanted to learn. About rain that does not stop, about mountain warfare that turns sergeants into small armies, about the limits of ammunition and the psychology of mud. Ben flew interdiction under skies that could go from postcard to slate in 2 hours. He learned the names of little bridges that mattered out of proportion to their span. He learned that when you see a locomotive with its steam already venting, you are already late, and that if you see a locomotive sitting silent by a tunnel, you are just in time to ruin something that will never be counted properly. He learned to count the number of times he had diverged from briefed altitude and to tell no one else that number, because pilots and priests keep some catalogues to themselves. Frank moved through chestnut groves, where leaves fell into foxholes and became bedding if you ignored the damp. He learned that an Italian farmer's advice about a path is more accurate than a lieutenant's if the lieutenant is new and the farmer's family has lived there since Charlemagne had acne. He learned that the quality of an army can be measured by how quickly it builds duckboards after rain. He watched a unit of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force march by, patches he had never seen, faces he had not expected, and he smiled at the world showing up. Anna processed redeployment orders and casualty lists without seeing the word end. She handled cables that reported Rome's liberation in language that tried to be modest and failed a little, which she forgave. She saw the phrase diverted to Northwest Europe again and again as shipping and priority had to serve the enormous appetite of the Normandy front. Italy felt in her office like a patient kept stable while the surgeon worked next door. She resented the metaphor and then set it aside because resentment wastes paper. Aiko received a photograph from a nurse she knew at a stateside hospital. Rows of beds, boys asleep in daylight, a window open to let summer in. A radio on a stand broadcasting baseball as if baseball were a kind of morphine. The note on the back read, "Italy's in these faces." Aiko put it in the drawer with her ration cards and her bond receipts and the clipping of a woman with a wrench. She had begun to curate a museum of endurance by accident. Robert's plant, now expert at rebuilding as well as building, shipped parts to Italy that were meant not only for weapons, but for roads. Planks, steel matting, bridge kits. He had learned that a 6-foot span over a ditch can delay a battalion as thoroughly as a blown viaduct. He wrote to a procurement officer in a tone he would not have used in 1942, respectful and hard. Send more planking. Ask fewer questions. There's mud where you are sending paper. Through autumn 1944, the Gothic Line bent as Allied armies pushed hard. On the Adriatic side, the 8th Army ground forward toward Rimini under rain and resistance. On the Tyrrhenian side, 5th Army worked north through Florence's skirts into hills that seemed to have learned to hate traction. The German commander kept his formations coherent. His reserves, never abundant, always existed at the point that hurt. The Allied solution was not a master stroke, but many competent blows repeated. Winter arrived with the front still in the mountains, and the planners rewrote calendars, while soldiers rewrote their virtues into patience. In cities behind the line, Florence, liberated, with the Arno running under repaired spans, people argued politics with a relish that made you believe in something beyond a ration card. Partisans fought and were shot and fought again. Jews in hiding lived day to day, each knock at a door a test. The RSI's apparatus hunted, Allied military government improvised. War in Italy was never only arrows on maps, it was also wine shared when it should have been saved, and sympathy given when it should have been hoarded. Frank learned to say grazie like he meant it. The air war over Italy ended 1944 without ceremony, but with effect. Rail traffic, counted in December, looked thinner than in June. The Foggia complex had become a machine for projecting insistence across the Alps and into a continent that was itself buckling under blows from the north and west. Ben flew one mission that winter when the Alps were so clear it felt like someone had washed the sky, and he saw the Brenner Pass like a groove you could put your finger through, and he thought, this is how armies ride over mountains now, on rails in the crosshairs. Anzio's graves faced the sea, Cassino's cemetery faced the hill, Rome's streets filled with people again, fashionable and hungry at the same time. Naples sold fish, as it always had, and counted new cranes that lifted cargo with a confidence that felt like defiance. The long climb had not finished, but the view backward was real. Sicily's dust, Salerno's bowl, Cassino's rubble, Anzio's mud, Rome's stone, Florence's bridges. Each place wrote an instruction. Each instruction became a habit. The soft underbelly had been all bone, and the bone had been cracked not by any one hammer, but by the daily application of blows, by the engineering of supply, by the humility to reorganize, by the courage to climb again tomorrow. Jack closed his locker and found a scrap of paper he'd been carrying since Salerno. Numbers from a fire mission, barely legible. He kept it because he believed that proof of usefulness fits in a pocket. He folded it again and put it back. The ship rolled gently, and he thought about the odd comfort of a deck you've lived on longer than any apartment. Frank cleaned his rifle in a barn where a Madonna looked down from a niche. He nodded to her without irony and told himself the spring would come and the mud would let go. He told himself the line ahead had seams, because all lines do, and that his job was to be there when someone found one. He slipped his feet into dry socks and felt like a rich man for 10 minutes. Ben wrote to his mother and told her he had seen Rome from the air and that it looked like a city drawn by a patient hand. He did not tell her about the day he had had to jettison his bombs over hills because the target was socked in, and he could not find an alternate that did not have a farmhouse on it. He didn't tell her because he did not know which sin would be worse, the one committed or the one considered. Anna stacked the last of the day's papers, turned off the lamp, and stood for a moment with her hand on the back of her chair. she imagined the Apennines in darkness, a string of tiny fires where men warmed their hands and thought about nothing for a blessed minute. She went home by a different route and bought an orange from a grocer who had two, because luxury must be caught while it passes. Aiko folded laundry in a room that smelled of soap and breath and winter. She thought about Italy whenever she heard a church bell on the quarter hour and wondered whether the war had changed the sound in those towns or only the listening. She placed a new clipping in the drawer, Rome on June 4th, and closed it softly. The long climb through Italy did not deliver the decisive instrument that headlines adore. It delivered something slower and perhaps more profound. A campaign that pulled divisions and Luftwaffe groups away from France, ports that fed the Allied ability to move, airfields that opened doors for bombs whose effect rippled far beyond the boot, a proving ground where coalition command matured, soldiers forged into organizations that could be trusted with the next thing. In the spring of 1945, those next things would break the remaining bones and spill the war out of its shell. But in 1943 and 1944, on island and mainland, on beach and ridge, in Abbey Shadow and City Square, the Allies learned to climb and to keep climbing when the slope was steeper than the brochure had promised. Italy was never the soft way in. It was the way in that taught everyone what hardness really means. From mountain passes and stone cities, the war's path turned inward, to mills, yards, labs, classrooms and kitchens where victory would be built before it was shipped. Factories became fronts. It took time for the phrase to feel literal instead of patriotic, but by late 1942, the country discovered that production lines could wound the enemy as surely as artillery. The miracle was not any single plant, but the choreography between them, ore pulled from Minnesota moving to a blast furnace in Pennsylvania, whose ingots crossed the Alleghenies to an Ohio rolling mill, whose sheets rode rails to a California shipyard where welders in bandanas stitched them into a hull that would carry trucks made in Detroit and wheat bagged in Kansas. Each step looked small from the ground. From the sky of statistics, it looked like a continent deciding to move. Dr. Robert Hale learned to watch the war from a catwalk. His plant, an aircraft factory that had looked ambitious in 1941 and looked merely average by 1943 as the industry exploded around it, became the vantage point where he measured the nation's change. Below him, rivet guns chattered, each burst a metronome for a symphony the workers could not hear in full. The floor was a grid of jigs and fixtures, parts bins and carts, and people threading between like intelligent current. He developed a habit. The first lap of his morning was quiet, hands behind his back, eyes finding the weak places. The second lap was talk. Foreman, tool and die geniuses, new hires still uncertain at their stations, women with sleeves rolled above elbows that ached at night, teenagers who should have been in civics and were learning civics here. Willow Run was the measure everyone knew. It stood out the way a mountain does on a flat map. Impossible until you accept that it has been drawn to scale. The B-24 Liberator had been designed as a long-legged bomber. Henry Ford promised to extrude them like cars. The promise offended engineers who loved subtlety, and then the plant began to disgorge aircraft with a rhythm that made subtlety irrelevant. A mile-long line stitched wings to center sections and fed fuselages past stations where teams learned to solve problems by not letting them pass. Sub-assemblies from across the Midwest arrived like guests to a well-run wedding. On certain days, a completed bomber rolled out every hour, then more. The plant inverted habits. Instead of craftsmen shaping metal to fit their imagination, jigs dictated imagination to fit metal. Critics, mostly from the old country of hand-fit and finish, fell silent under numbers. Dr. Hale visited once, took notes, and brought back not the myth but the method. Break the complex into pieces you can standardize and teach. Teach without condescension. Move the work to the worker. Surface failures early. Reward the fix, not the apology. Liberty ships were the home front's plain speech. The early ones creaked and were mocked. Ugly ducklings. Adhesive barges. And then they multiplied so quickly that the jokes ran out of breath. The design favored speed and simplicity. Straight lines, welded seams, standardized parts. The yards learned to build them in weeks, then in days, some in what looked like a race just to prove they could. Kaiser's shipyards along the west coast found a tempo that frightened peacetime sensibilities. The yards functioned like cities, dry docks as neighborhoods, cranes as church steeples, cafeterias as public squares. Robert memorized the number of plates in a single hull section so he could picture the job the next time someone told him about a schedule that sounded implausible. He began to understand something he had not as an academic. When you remove fear from a deadline and replace it with craft, human beings become more ambitious, not less careful. Kaiser made speed into culture. The yards treated time as an enemy that could be killed daily. Prefabrication moved major assemblies closer to a Lego logic. Sections built under cover in shops where rain and wind did not matter, then rolled out and swung into place by cranes that acquired personalities. Welding replaced rivets not because welds are romantic, but because they are fast, light, and, when inspectors get the power they need, trustworthy. Crews learn to stitch a keel and a deck the way a seamstress knows when a hem will hold because of the feel, not the gaze. The day the record fell, Hull launched in less than a week. Headlines treated it like a carnival trick. The Navy treated it like oxygen. Aluminum and rubber were the quiet wars. Airplanes are aluminum hungry. The nation fed them by retooling smelters that had grown up near cheap electricity. Hydro dams in the northwest humming like sermons. TVA's lines humming across valleys. Bauxite imports and domestic ore processing became timetables pinned beside shift calendars. Scrap drives pulled pots and pans into piles that resembled folk art, then melted them into something skin and spar could accept. Rubber required invention as much as effort. With natural rubber cut off by conquests in Southeast Asia, chemists turned laboratories into orchards. Synthetic rubber plants sprouted. Buna N, butadiene, styrene, the vocabulary of the new crop. Tires stopped being luxuries and became allocations. Retread shops learned to treat the old with respect. Drivers learned to coast like monks. Robert bought a chart with curves showing flex and wear. He tacked it up where the foreman would see it and reminded them that every pound shaved off an airframe's weight paid dividends at 1,000 miles. Fuel was a frontier. The enemy's synthetic fuel efforts made Allied planners nervous and Allied chemists competitive. Stateside refining capacity expanded while catalyst development moved from journals into vats. High-octane gasoline was the prize, 100 octane, then 130, giving engines the detonation resistance to accept more boost, more power, more climb, more chance of coming home. Cracking units multiplied, and the scent of refineries became the background perfume of coastal towns. Engineers learned to talk to pilots. If we give you this, what will you do? The answers returned in engine settings and climb rates and notes about how far a bomber group could push a headwind before turning back. Radar was magic until it became a tool. Its development, accelerated by British desperation and American scale, crossed the boundary between lab coat and layman quickly. Once the klystron and cavity magnetron found homes in chassis that could ride in aircraft or sit under ship radomes, the job became production and training. Boxes had to leave the plant calibrated, sailors had to leave schools with instincts about how weather paints a screen and how a coastline lies when the sea is rough. Proximity fuses, born in secret, changed artillery from geometry to prophecy. Shells with small, reliable brains burst near a target rather than at a guessed range. Airbursts that shredded aircraft and infantry with a cold efficiency that made casualty officers' pens scratch in new patterns. The factories that built those delicate devices were temple quiet inside. Women with steady hands placed components with the attention of jewelers, and the pressure of knowing that one flaw multiplied by 10,000 becomes a statistic someone's brother notices. Code-breaking had factories too, even if they wore the disguise of offices. Machine rooms throbbed with electromechanical diners, the American bombs chewing tapes like breakfast rushes, the relay racks clicking in patterns that made sense only to the few who could hear mathematics in metal percussion. Typists and linguists and file clerks formed the muscle that moved intelligence from raw to useful. Anna Miller, now senior enough to be trusted with compartments that had been hinted at rather than named, learned to appreciate the pace. Decrypts are perishable, their value decays as the enemy moves. The assembly line for intelligence was real. Intercept, route, attack, check against crib, machine time, human review, dissemination, burn bag. She remembered the day when a naval decrypt shaved hours off a convoy's danger by redirecting it around a wolf pack. She walked home in a rain that felt like reprieve. Women turned factories into schools where nobody asked if they belonged after the first month. Rosie the Riveter was a poster and a person. She existed in thousands of hands. Bandanas kept hair from gears, and bandaged fingers wrapped around air ratchets that kicked if you disrespected them. Women trained other women, not as a concession, but because it worked. The plant, daycare that had been controversial in the spring, was crowded by fall. The buses ran 2 directions. Overnight shifts were real. In lunchrooms, a new language formed, a grammar of talk specs and child care, absenteeism and anemia, grinding wheels and grocery lines. The first time a foreman called a woman by her job title, rather than sister, Dr. Hale made a note that meant more to him than any production chart. Culture changes when laziness is punished by inefficiency. Waves and wasps filled hangars and flight lines with competence that upset those who had been comfortable. The Navy's women worked communications, meteorology, navigation, maintenance, uniforms neat, hairpins invisible, authority juggling politeness and insistence. Women Air Force service pilots ferried aircraft from plant to base to depot, and did it without the luxury of myth-making. They learned to climb into cockpits that had not assumed their physiognomy and to carry with them the authority to sign a form that meant a combat crew would trust an airplane tomorrow. One Wasp flew a new bomber out of Hale's plant, and his crew gathered shamelessly at a window to watch her raise the gear with a grace that embarrassed their skepticism. She waved on climb out with a movement so economical it felt like an answer. African-American labor remade the arithmetic of industry and the politics of the war at the same time. The Double V campaign, victory abroad, victory at home, was a demand written onto lunch counters and time clocks. We will fight this war, but we will not accept that a badge worn on a sleeve entitles one to paper privileges only. A. Philip Randolph's pressure-forced executive action, factories integrated under rules that grew teeth. The first black welders in a shipyard suffered 100 small insults and then trained the second and third waves. In Hale's plant, a toolroom genius named Sam Little solved a fixture tolerance problem that had cost 10 hours per bomber. The fix saved weeks in a month. A few weeks later, Sam walked into the cafeteria with a white colleague to find the seat beside him unoccupied like a hole in a tooth. Dr. Hale sat. The next day, more seats filled. It was not sainthood, it was arithmetic. Lost time is lost lives, and bigotry wastes time. Later, in a newsreel, Hale glimpsed the 332nd Fighter Group taxi past in Italy, red tails bright as a promise, and he felt a loop close between a wrench in Michigan and a sky over Europe. Wartime science turned time into a consumable. Projects that should have taken 10 years took 2 because bottlenecks were identified and crushed, because a memo could compel steel and men, because failure was budgeted into plans rather than hidden under discouragement. Universities learned to swallow contracts. Labs grew security fences. Radar sets moved from bench to bench until a chain existed. Proximity fuses saw their prototypes become lot numbers. In a separate compartment, the country kept quiet. The velocity of effort reached fever. Piles grew under the desert sun. Cyclotrons spun in ivy halls. Mathematicians wrote on chalkboards about neutrons as if they were discussing an unfamiliar music. Even outside that compartment, accelerators multiplied. Aviation medicine tuning oxygen delivery. Metallurgy finding heat-treat recipes that let landing gear survive abusive landings. Pharmacology turning penicillin into an industrial process, saving soldiers who would have been a footnote in 1918. Robert measured the war by hands. They arrived untrained and learned a craft that had been divided into smaller crafts, so the learning could be fast and the mistakes contained. He watched a 17-year-old, paperwork neat, chest out, walk to a wing panel jig like he had been called by a whistle only he could hear. A union steward paused to correct his posture and his grip on the bucking bar, and the two became a small, temporary guild. The line did not slow for kindness. Kindness was the accelerant. The plant was a school for the gruff, teach or lose. Robert's pocket notebook filled with names, not because he was sentimental, but because people who feel seen work better. He discovered late one night under fluorescence that made everybody look tired, that leadership is mostly the distribution of attention. Telegrams walked into kitchens the way winter walks into a room when the door is opened wide. The home front accepted ration books because rationing felt like the least one could do when a boy with your town's name printed under his stood guard in a place the weather did not love. Sugar scarcity invented recipes that grandmothers improved. Gasoline coupons lived clipped on kitchen hooks next to aprons. Tires were patched until they looked like maps. War bonds absorbed wages and imaginations. Posters asked for a portion of every paycheck and gave back an image of a ship in silhouette or a child's face under a parenthesis of hope. The bonds bought steel that would be welded by people who had sold the bonds to themselves. When the payday at Willow Run pay line snaked past the bond desk, women and men stopped as if gravity had been increased temporarily at that spot. The toolbox of the arsenal expanded even into pastures. New pipelines, Big Inch and Little Big Inch, carried crude and products from Texas to the East Coast, dodging U-boats by avoiding the ocean entirely. Pipe fitters became strategists. Pump stations wore camouflage. Accountants learned to love op amps and gauges because a pipe that doesn't surge is a friend to every refinery downstream. On a board near his office, Hale drew a crude map with thick pencil lines that just connected dots. This pipe means that ship leaves full. That ship means those crates make it to port. Those crates mean… He stopped himself. The chain almost always ended in someone's son. Rubber plantations were replaced by coal and chemistry. Aluminum was replaced by a new scale of bauxite and electricity. Fuel by cracking and pooling. Steel by more ore and more coke and more shifts. But the replacement that mattered most was the replacement of disbelief with routine. The first time a plant ran 3 shifts 7 days a week, it made newsreels. The 10th time, it made a habit. Men and women learned to sleep at odd hours and live in strange kitchens. Restaurants threw victory specials on menus with less meat and more honesty. The country learned to do without in order to say yes to more. Training and safety turned from chores into cults. Early in the ramp-up, injuries were a second hidden war. Fingers were lost to presses, eyes to flying shards, lungs to solvents because managers rushed and labourers tried to be brave with the wrong muscles. Safety officers got a budget and a mandate. Posters grew more blunt. Guards were installed on every wheel, shroud and blade. PPE became as obvious as a hard hat. Nurses and medics on site turned into full clinics that could splint a wrist and rebuild a schedule that saved a family a day of wages. Robert saw the curve of incidents bend down and felt a pride usually reserved for graphs labelled units per day. He celebrated with a promise not to let the curve rise. Education turned wartime into 2-year colleges of the practical. Blueprint reading courses filled. Women and men learned tolerances and call-outs, metallurgy's moods, how a micrometer lies when your hands are cold. High schools ran classes in drafting at night. Civic clubs hosted lectures on riveting patterns that drew improbably appreciative applause. In one hysteria-fueled month, a rumour swept the plant floor. The bolts used to hold wing spars were being counterfeited by a supplier cutting threads poorly. Robert drove all night, unannounced, to the supplier and found tired men doing their best. He signed for more inspectors and sent coffee instead of threats. The bolts improved. The rumour died. Trust was tempered steel, heat, quench, test. Churches and unions learned to share pulpits. Victory gardens were planted next to union halls where grievance boards and production committees met with more overlap of membership than anyone predicted. The rhythm of the week changed. Sunday morning, church and the radio. Sunday afternoon, stamps in a ration book. Sunday evening, extra shift at the yard because a hull number had to become a name before Monday. Babies were named for uncles whose letters from training had sounded like grown men's voices trying on hope. Machines learned memory. Jigs, once novel, became institutional knowledge made physical. Holes in the right place, clamp pressure repeatable, fixtures locking in ways apprentices came to trust like light switches. Machines encoded the wisdom of the first good build and offered it to the 1,000th. The cost of one correct choice was therefore amortized across months. It made Robert evangelical about first article inspection. Spend a day now to save a ship. Later, when a manager scoffed, he took the man to the rail yard and had him count the flat cars waiting for parts that had failed fit. Counting humbled him. Counting was the faith of the arsenal. Jack's family in New York moved to a smaller apartment closer to his mother's job at a garment factory that now stitched canvas bags for radios and canvas covers for Jeeps. She started speaking about stitch length and oil types, the way her father had once spoken about tides. She sent Jack a letter that smelled faintly of machine oil, and he held it to his face in a wardroom and felt briefly that the whole nation had crawled inside the same tent, separate cots, same weather. Frank's father learned to work a second job nights at a plant that turned out shell casings. The older man laughing at his own surprise that he liked the feel of a micrometer more than gambling. He wrote to Frank about a foreman named Lou who cared as much about 1/100th of an inch as any priest ever cared about a confession. Frank read the letter on the hood of a truck in Italy and thought implausibly that he could see the 100th of an inch from here. Ben's cousin took a job at an instrument company that made gyro horizons and compasses. She learned to balance gimbals with a touch so light it made the coarseness of some neighbors' opinions unbearable by contrast. She wrote to Ben that she had signed her name on a box going to Foggia and asked him if he might see it. He didn't, of course. No one ever sees that exact box. But he wrote back that he would look harder at the next one. Iko's office adopted a plant across town that had lost workers to the draft and needed clerical help to keep tabs on payroll and shifts. She spent Saturdays adding columns by hand, and then an engineer showed her a Monroe calculator that stepped like a horse through numbers. She laughed out loud at the speed and then cried alone in the restroom because the joy of faster addition of wages carried inside it the knowledge that some of those wages would be sent home to families who never got a last letter. Anna lobbied for more couriers and won. A week later, a courier she had hired moved a package so quickly a supply ship's departure was held for one more crate of radar spare parts. She wrote a note to herself. Paper rearranges ships. It sounded grandiose until the after-action came back from a destroyer's captain praising an operator who had a spare receiver ready when Salt ate the first. She taped that sentence inside her desk, where no one could see it, because it would have looked like pride, and it was, but it was also a receipt. The arsenal learned to improvise at scale. When a steel mill's blast furnace cracked a lining that would take weeks to repair, a patch invention was floated on a Friday and implemented by Monday. Every hour saved purchased with uncomfortable risk and better inspection. When a strike threatened at a plant producing magnetrons, a mediator with a photograph of his son in uniform on his desk found words both sides could agree were not insulting. When a flood threatened a rail line that was the only way out for tanks in quantity, National Guard units and Boy Scouts threw sandbags under a red sun while mothers brought coffee in thermoses that did not leak. The river bent, the tanks moved. Factories became fronts, not in the martyrdom sense, though people died in them, but in the operational sense. Tools were weapons, schedules were tactics, foremen were sergeants, plant managers were corps commanders, procurement officers were quartermasters whose enemy was scarcity and whose ally was ingenuity. Victory gardens were not symbolism. They were calories that freed rail cars. Scrap drives were not nostalgia, they were ore at the margin. The language of battle migrated, bottleneck, choke point, surge, pivot, interdict, attrit. The lived experience of the arsenal fed the lived experience at the front, and the reverse flowed back. Letters from Italy and the Central Pacific taught engineers why clamps should be reachable wearing gloves in the rain, why manuals should be written like recipes, why specs on a sight glass should be larger, why a bolt-head chamfer saved swearing in the dark. Robert's plant adopted first-time quality as a motto with teeth. Inspectors were promoted for unpopularity. Say no now, so a pilot doesn't say a prayer later. He opened the floor on a Sunday, not to make more parts, but to let workers bring their families to walk the line. He stood by the fuselage section where a placard explained load paths in a wing and translated jargon into kitchen talk. See this? This spar carries the heavy. This skin carries shape. This fastener carries nothing alone. Together they carry a boy home. He watched a grandmother touch the aluminum like it might bruise and whisper a name. He went home, sat on his porch and allowed himself one whiskey, which he warmed with his hand for a minute because it seemed wrong to enjoy anything cold if a plant somewhere was still lit. As 1944 deepened, the arsenal's tempo felt less like an emergency and more like a national character. Breakfast radio led with tonnage delivered. Mayors boasted about yard numbers the way high school principals boast about football scores. Newspapers printed lifting capacity beside weather. A new phrase appeared in speeches, war-weary. It was greeted not by cynicism, but by a tightening of jawlines. Weary did not mean done. It meant we had learned how to do this and would continue until the math on the enemy's wall looked like ours. More red than black, more subtraction than addition. Factories made more than weapons. They made habits that would survive peace. Women accustomed to competence who would not surrender it easily. Black workers accustomed to earning parity who would demand it always. Managers accustomed to measuring outcomes rather than pedigrees. Unions accustomed to being partners in strategy rather than opponents across a table. Cities accustomed to coordinating with their neighbors. Universities accustomed to thinking that applied knowledge can be noble. It would take years to digest those habits. Some would be rejected, some fought over, some quietly normalized until politicians would later pretend they had always been so. Robert caught a flu in November and missed 2 days for the first time since Pearl Harbor. On the third day, he walked the line with a scarf and realized he had slowed down enough to see small beauties. The way a drill bit lifts a perfect spiral of aluminum that looks like a child's ringlet and falls to the floor. The way two women communicating across a jig did it with a hand language not taught anywhere. The way a crate stenciled for the Pacific smelled slightly of pine and paint and distance. He wrote those 3 things on his notepad and then, embarrassed by the sentiment, wrote below them the number of hours saved by relocating a parts bin. He accepted that he was the sort of man now who needed both columns. Some nights, when the lamps were turned down and the machines snored to a stop, the plant sounded like a ship in gentle swell. Robert lingered just to hear it, the tick of metal contracting, the exhale of compressors, the shuffle of a lone janitor's feet. He would walk to a wing that was half built and put his hand on a spar cap and feel the cool. He would think of Ben in a sky full of gun flash and expectorant flak, and of Jack hunched over a set where the sea sounds electrical, and of Frank rubbing a foot by a lantern and pretending not to be afraid, and of Iko's typewriter and Anna's pencil, and he would say the same sentence softly. This is their shield. Factories became fronts. The arsenal of democracy was not a speech. It was a lived routine. It was shifts that turned sunrises into trivia. It was trains that wrote their presence into towns with whistles at 3 a.m. It was the smell of solvents and the taste of cafeteria coffee. It was the velocity of learning. It was the habit of measuring. It was the decency of people who signed their name somewhere on a piece of metal and believed that signature went with it into danger. When victory came, it would not be a surprise. It would be a dividend paid out to a nation that had invested in competence. And when peace came, the plants would quiet, and men and women would listen to the silence the way sailors listen for the sea in a shell. Some would miss the tempo, most would miss the clarity. Almost all would keep something of it, an insistence on doing the job right the first time, a suspicion of excuses, a belief that their hands, together, once made something enormous move. From the clatter of rivet guns and the hum of assembly lines, the war's sound moved back to surf and steel, to chalk cliffs and hedges older than nations. Planning for Overlord grew like coral, layer by layer, invisible at first, then hard enough to walk on. It was not one plan, but a stack of them, each heavier than the last, each tested until it wobbled or held. Commanders argued in rooms where the walls looked tired of maps. Staff officers learned to breathe through a pencil. The arithmetic was brutal and simple at once. Put enough ships, aircraft, men and supplies in one slice of coast to break a continent open and do it faster than the enemy can understand, let alone respond. The deception, Operation Bodyguard, the soft handshake hiding a closed fist, sent ghosts to Kent. Dummy tanks under canvas, an invented army with an American accent, radio traffic chattering to no one. Weather, the general none of them could command, sat offshore with arms crossed and decided who was lying. Jack Torres's destroyer joined a fleet so large it could have been mistaken for a migrating city. In anchorages, ships bumped like cattle, and every signal flag felt important. He listened to rehearsals on the radio net. call signs practicing as if the syllables themselves could promise survival. He read the meteorological summaries when nobody was looking and learned to respect the verbs moderate, rising, freshening. On the night of June 4th, hope and tide were out of phase. On June 5th, the weather bent, not enough to make anyone comfortable, enough to push men into boats. Airborne troops would draw the first lines. They lifted in the dark, bellies of aircraft heavy with men who had jumped at night so many times they could feel the wind before it touched them. They carried maps that would lie to them, cricket clickers for recognition, and courage packed into pockets with candy. Their mission read like a math problem with too many variables: seize causeways behind Utah, destroy bridges near the Orne, hold exits, confuse the enemy, be everywhere at once. The sky over Normandy, narrowed as cloud and flak, wrote a new language across it. Planes missed drop zones, flew too fast, dropped too low. Parachutes opened like flowers scattered in a storm. Groups landed fields away, sometimes miles, alone and in clusters that did not match anyone's roster. And yet the countryside woke to the sound of small wars starting in every hedgerow. A farmhouse window flared and then shattered. A paratrooper, alone, gathered two others with a whisper and a click, and turned east because the map in his head said east was where a bridge needed to be a gap. Ben Carter, flying later that morning with fighter bomber cover, knew some of those men by silhouette only, a tiny dome of silk against dim fields, and by the sudden spark of firefight in a hamlet where no road showed on his chart. He watched the airborne arm draw veins behind the beach and felt a respect so sharp it almost hurt. These men had to make the map match them. He tightened his harness and listened to his own breath when the flak began to stitch. Dawn pulled colour out of the channel in reluctant increments. The run, too, sure felt both too long and too short. Utah and Omaha lay to the west of the invasion front, the American beaches with names that sounded friendly only to people who had never met them. Utah's currents shoved the first wave south of their intended landing. It might have been disaster. It turned out to be luck. The terrain there was friendlier than the chosen sector, the resistance lighter, and a general on the sand. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., limping and grinning, said the sentence that anchors all improvisation. "We'll start the war from right here." The exits off the beach still had to be opened. The causeways still had to be taken, but men were coming ashore and moving inland with a rhythm that felt like a plan, remembering its lines. Omaha was not forgiving. The tide lay wrong. The obstacles ate boats. The shingle offered only the cowardly kindness of a low lip in a storm of machine gun arcs. The bluffs held concrete and men with good fields of fire. Tanks drowned. Engineers died with charges in their hands. Radio nets filled with the crowding sound of units talking at once, because silence was worse. The first hours were a negotiation with terror, measured in feet. Men crawled, not toward glory, but toward a better angle. Navy coxswains steered back into a killing ground because the alternative was leaving friends to drown. Jack's destroyer pushed in so close that the smell of cordite from shore mixed with the ship's own, and the gunnery officer took direct calls from men sheltering under the cliff. "Put one on that embrasure," they said, and the 5-inch spoke like a friend, then again, until the hole stopped spitting. A beach that had looked like a plan turned into a shallow grave, and then, by noon and willpower and shells, and the kind of leadership that does not waste adjectives, into a place where men could stand up and run. Civilians in Normandy woke in a world that had chosen for them. Farmers led cows away from fields that had turned into artillery problems. Mothers gathered children into cellars that had been swept for years without imagining they would be needed. Resistance contacts put on armbands that had been folded into mattresses. A baker who had learned to stretch flour with cabbage watched paratroopers slide along walls past his shop and whispered, "Bon." A woman with white hair and a black dress stood at her door and offered water to Americans covered in sand and something darker. And then she shut the door and cried like a young girl because she had told herself not to pray, and now she was unsure whether she had prayed anyway. The foothold stretched, then deepened. The mulberries, artificial harbours with names that sounded like nursery rhymes, took shape off the beaches, a necklace of sunken blockships, floating roadways that swayed but held, caissons like concrete whales. One would die in a storm, the other would feed the continent. Pluto, pipelines under the ocean, was a rumour, and then a line in the ledger, not yet the artery it would later become, but a promise that petrol could travel where U-boats could not. Cherbourg's port, bristling, had to be taken from behind, and when it was, it greeted engineers with sabotage and cunning. The Red Ball Express began as a concept and became a living, snorting snake of trucks, many driven by African-American soldiers whose double V had taught them to expect no favors and receive none, hauling fuel, ammo, food in a loop that ignored sleep. Logistics had a face, grease-streaked, coffee-breathed, bone-tired, intent. The hedgerows, the bocage, made the next weeks a kind of surgery. Fields were not fields. They were rooms with earthen walls shoulder-high, reinforced by centuries of root and stone. Every turn of a lane was an ambush, rehearsed by an audience that had not expected to play this part. A rifle squad could disappear behind a lip, and a tank could present only a turret to an enemy who preferred angles to heroics. The first days were pain and instruction. Tanks nosed up, silhouettes announced themselves, and recoilless facts answered. Men learned to use bayonets not in the old romantic way, but as pry bars for roots. Grenades travelled in arcs that smelled like math. Radios lost their voices under leaves. Couriers found new routes. Through kitchens, across barns, under the prayer of a chapel arch. Civilians lived between lines that moved a few meters an hour and measured progress in the number of shells that landed in the orchard. Frank DeLuca felt the hedgerow in his shoulders. He moved by impression, a dark cut in green ahead, a lark startled into a spiral, a smell of manure that meant a farmyard and therefore a possible kill zone. He learned to place a bar in a specific wedge, to lean his cheek against earth that had never been so intimately attacked. A sergeant showed him how to climb the bank with his body close, how to pop up and not be curious, how to let someone else be curious and live longer. The squad's language simplified: left, right, wait, now, go. When a tank with welded-on prongs, Cullen's hedgerow cutter, born of a corporal's scrounged steel and a colonel's willingness to say yes, chewed into a bank and made a door, Frank grinned with weary gratitude for American profanity. Turned into engineering, Ben's sorties sliced along the edges of that green maze. Fighter bombers stitched a hedgerow corner where a lieutenant on a SCR 300 had learned to speak only in compass and distance. Smoke panels lay on fields like notes. The air-to-ground net became a tutorial. Mark with white, left of smoke, no, your other left. Thunderbolts and typhoons flattened hedgerow strongpoints with cannon and rocket until the green turned brown and then into something that smelled of sap and worse. Coordination improved because failure had made it improve. The sky over Normandy belonged to the Allies, not by decree, but by daily execution. German columns, moved by night with headlights hooded, and in daylight conformed to the plodding geometry of fear. At Omaha and Utah and the British and Canadian beaches, command friction ran on a spectrum, from healthy disagreement to the kind of misunderstandings that killed. It was sorted by a new competence in liaison, by officers who had learned not to assume, and by radios that carried apology and correction with equal bandwidth. Anna Miller behind a desk that had once seemed too small for the world and now felt exactly sized to it, moved a flood of paperwork that kept backrooms synchronized. Landing tables revised, ammunition allotments, medical resupply schedules, replacements wrung from ports and railheads by a chain of signatures. She taped to her wall a photograph of a Red Bull convoy taken by a friend of a friend. Trucks, nose to tail in rain, tarps flapping, drivers' faces invisible, and made it her icon. After weeks of hedgerow inches came a plan to turn inches into miles. The breakout, Operation Cobra, aimed to shatter the German line south of St. Lo and either roll it or compel it to run. The prelude was a storm of bombing that looked from a distance like geology changing its mind. Bombers droned in streams so consistent that men on the ground could anticipate the next flight by the rhythm of their own breath. Markers were laid, errors occurred. Short bombs fell among American units, reducing men into stories that friends refused to tell for years. Frank lay in dirt that danced like water and thought his teeth would crack. When the earth fell back into itself and the bombers departed, the line ahead had been ploughed into something less certain than defense. Tanks and infantry moved, not as if they were racing, but as if a door had been cracked and they were unwilling to let it close. Open a door, hold the door, pour an army through. That was the mantra whispered in 100 battalion command posts. Once the seam appeared, it was widened with cunning and speed. Columns nosed through holes that did not exist at dawn. The terrain beyond the bocage softened into country that rewarded horsepower. The German order of battle, mauled and brittle, could not be everywhere. Mortain's counterattack tried to scissor the advance back into shape. It was read, met and punished under a sky that made German armor feel naked. The Falaise pocket formed slowly and then, all at once, with Canadians and Poles and Americans and French grimly folding a bag while German units spilled out and were cut down or captured. Civilians watched the roadways fill with retreat and shame and burned oil, and later they would hide their faces from memory. Jack's ship escorted a train of American pontoon barges up the Seine's estuary after Le Havre became usable in anything but name. He watched cranes reanimate like resentful giants. He thought, incongruously, of Robert Hale's catwalk and the way a rivet line becomes a river only when you step back. On the radio, he heard new place names, Argentan, Falaise, and old advice said in new tones, do not outrun your fuel. Logistics played the melody even during the solos. The Red Bull Express expanded its loop. A traffic discipline emerged peculiar to war. Right of way for gas and bullets over everything, even generals' cars. Fines paid in profanity. African-American drivers, by the tens of thousands, kept their trucks alive with roadside repair, cannibalizing parts in the rain. Foxholes dug with wrenches, not shovels. Double V became daily, unromantic victory. A convoy that made it, a tire that held, a filter changed in time. Paris, which had been occupied as an idea more than a bastion, erupted in its own time, barricades and tricolour, and the stubborn desire to own the narrative of one's freedom. The Allies adjusted, as they always had, mixing prudence with respect. French divisions, free and regularized, marched under their own flags, a symmetry that made good politics and honest history. Frank, passing the city's edge days later, saw a girl on a bicycle wearing a dress too clean for the war and felt something in his chest redo its math. He was not just fighting against, he was fighting for. He did not tell anyone this. Such sentences did not belong in a foxhole. If Cobra had been a lesson in concentration, September offered a different temptation. Audacity. Operation Market Garden proposed to leap rivers instead of testing them, to bound across bridges that a wary enemy would guard, to end the war by making the geography irrelevant through speed. Airborne divisions would fall on a corridor through the Netherlands, town by town, Eindhoven, Nijmegen, Arnhem, securing crossings for British armour to drive north like a spear slid through fabric. The plan carried the nervous glamour of a high-wire act. It also carried risk woven into the rope. Ben flew cover on the first day, the sky a mess of canvas and silk, the ground flickering with recognition panels and flak posies. The drops in daylight were beautiful from altitude in the way terrible things often are when looked at with the wrong eyes. The first bridges fell into friendly hands. Dutch civilians lined streets and wept and gave apples and kissed cheeks grudgingly rough with dust. Radios did not work as they should. Weather flirted with treachery. Intelligence about German armour in the area, accurate for the cautious, had been discounted by men in love with momentum. At Nijmegen, a river crossing turned into a legend under fire, boats rowing into a barrage that seemed to decide to spare only the number required for the story to work. At Arnhem, the last bridge, a battalion dug in at the north end and held like a lighthouse in a storm, surrounded, isolated, brave beyond usefulness. Frank listened to a British radio voice curled into itself, calm, clipped, starving, and wanted to walk to him across a map and hand him water. He could not. The road, the single road, the corridor, clogged and stalled, tanks nose to rear like cattle trapped in a gate. Artillery measured its blows and handed them out with a ration card. German units, surprised but never paralyzed, recovered their poise and their sense for the seam. The spear point dulled. The week disassembled itself into days and then into hours that tasted of smoke and patience and loss. A bridge too far would be the phrase later. In the moment, it was too many bridges held by too few for too long. Civilians along that road suffered not just shelling but whiplash. Flags came out, got folded back away. Collaborators were pulled into alleys and judged under a sky too blue for courts. A man with a cigarette shared it with a paratrooper who did not ask his politics. A girl who had never seen a black American before handed him a flower and understood immediately that the color of his skin had too little to do with the size of his smile. The war shrank and enlarged hearts at once. Anna typed the casualty reports for Market Garden with the speed of a woman who has learned that speed is a sacrament. She sent telegrams into neighborhoods where the tulips would still bloom next spring, as if flowers ever ask permission. Allied friction made headlines only when it misfired. Most days it was the hum of compromises that worked. Americans liked to push. British liked to pivot. Canadians liked to plan with paragraphs. Poles liked to plan with revenge. The French liked to plan with memory. Eisenhower made the mess coherent by refusing to be smart in a way that would starve someone. He was generous with credit and ruthless with tonnage. Ports mattered more than public relations. Antwerp, captured intact, remained bottled by the Scheldt estuary's guarded banks until Canadians and British and Poles went in and paid the bill that access to winter would require. Logistics won arguments by arriving where they said they would. Jack's destroyer shifted duties between the Channel and the Scheldt, escorting, bombarding, shepherding minesweepers whose work looked like tedium until a ship exploded and proved it was danger disguised. On a grey morning, he watched a Dutch barge slip past with 2 women and a child, and a piano lashed on deck. He wondered what music had cost to keep. He thought of Aiko's letters about ration cards and lilies on windowsills, and decided that every war is a quarrel about what is precious. The airborne men who returned from Market Garden had faces that made even old sergeants look away. They had held a door that nobody had managed to unlock from the other side. Ben wrote 3 letters to families he did not know, because sometimes pilots find it easier to talk to strangers about debt. He described nothing specific and everything important. Courage is a long verb, not an adjective. The way a man can refuse to stop being himself even when surrounded. Back in the hedgerows of memory, Normandy's civilians were still rebuilding walls with stones pulled out of fields and shells pulled out of walls. A priest said mass in a barn where cows chewed while boys practiced being serious. A school teacher wrote afternoon lessons on a shard of slate because her classroom's windows had been replaced by sky. A baker's daughter, 12, kept a notebook in which she tracked the names of soldiers who had slept in their loft, first names, home states, and attempt at the way they laughed. She did not know what to do with the names of the dead, so she left a blank space after them as if life might fill it later. The breakout's calculus never stopped. Supply had to obey weather and mud and bridges that could carry certain numbers and not others. The Red Bull's tires began to fail in predictable rhythms. Maintenance schedules wrote themselves into the language. Grease on Wednesday or shame on Friday. The loadmasters became celebrities when they found a way to fit one more crate without violating the laws of physics. African-American units, told without being told that their work would not be remembered with medals, built reputations in anecdotes and gallons. Frank met one of the drivers at a crossroads where both were lost for 5 minutes. They exchanged directions and insults and a cigarette, and something like a vow, keep this moving. In Paris, much later, a starving cat was fed from a soldier's ration tin, and that tiny charity became for him the definition of liberation. In a Norman hamlet, an apple tree blown apart by a shell sprouted in spring from a branch that had no right to live. In a churchyard near St. Lo, a boy traced with a finger the letters on a temporary cross and memorized a name he would not forget. He would become a carpenter and nail roofs that did not leak, and he would still know that name when his hair turned the color of flour. The friction inside the Allied machine never disappeared. Bradley and Montgomery argued about priority. Patton argued with everyone and sometimes with the weather. The British, whose blood was older in this war, held caution like a virtue. Americans, who had only recently learned to be good at war, held risk like a tool. Eisenhower kept the argument going, and the armies too. Logistics won again and again, and nobody wrote poems about it. Anna did write a line in a private notebook. Every mile of fuel line is a stanza. She smiled at her own sentiment and returned to work, which was her poem. The winter would bring a counterattack through the Ardennes, and the spring would bring a river crossed with bridges that held, and a country that had taught itself to be adequate would discover that adequacy multiplied is genius. But in the summer and fall of 1944, from D-Day to the breakout to a gamble in the Netherlands that did not pay, the Allies opened doors with blood and steel, held them with grit and organization, and poured an army through by learning the habits of victory. Frank learned to sleep sitting up. Ben learned to turn fear into checklists. Jack learned that the sea is a partner only when you respect its moods. Robert learned that a solved problem far away can look like a saved life with a different haircut. Iko learned that faith is not a word you say. It's the choice to type one more set of orders. Anna learned that the right comma in the right cable is as loyal as a friend. On a beach where tide and time had conspired to kill, the sea lay later as if nothing had happened. Children, months later, years later, ran into waves and screamed with the uncomplicated joy of cold water. Their parents watched and did not ruin it with words. In fields where hedgerows once enforced humility, cows returned, chewing in the rhythm of peace. Along a raised road outside Eindhoven, a bike bell rang. A man in a cap lifted a hand. A memory did not leave, but lay down and stopped shouting. The war would go on, but the door had been opened and held. The army had poured through. The continent had remembered its shape. From salt wind and hedgerow mud, the march rose into a season that bit the bone and made distances feel longer than maps allowed. The Ardennes in December was supposed to be a place to breathe. The line there had quieted to a hum, a sector where units rotated to rest, to study the way frost forms on fir needles, to pretend that the war could be paused like a radio. The roads were narrow ribs, the villages small ribs between them, the woods thick with trees that hid thoughts as easily as men. The German army read the calendar differently. On a grey morning that seemed too cold for surprises, the forest shook and spat armour and infantry into a snow that took footprints and kept them. Radios filled at once with two voices. The one learned in training that made commands sound inevitable, and the older voice that lives under the sternum and says, "This is wrong." The plan had a gambler's logic. A thrust through the thin sector would split American armies, cross the Meuse, aim for Antwerp, and hope weather would ground Allied air. The codename Wacht am Rhein pretended to be a defensive stance. The reality was offensive and desperate. Fuel was math in every staff officer's head. The columns carried just enough to reach Allied depots and win not only by surprise, but by siphon. The map was bold, the arithmetic brittle. Frank DeLuca's regiment had been told to practice patience. The Ardennes in early December was a classroom. Clean the rifle, check the boots, walk the lanes without startling the cows, drink coffee from enamel cups by stoves that convinced nobody they could warm a room. He had started a letter he intended to finish only when the words were better. On the morning the forest moved, the letter went into a pocket and stayed there, unreadable for a week. The first shells cracked the day cleanly in half. Before and after, men poured out of billets and into ditches, half-dressed for a war they thought was far away. The road outside the village suddenly had more vehicles than it had seen in a year. The sergeant's voice went from conversational to square, and Frank recognized a tone he had heard at Kasserine once. That sound commanders make when they are trying to drag a structure over chaos like a blanket. On the northern shoulder, Elsenborn Ridge became an argument the Americans were willing to have. The ground there gave the defenders what they needed: height enough to see, frozen soil that held when tracks clawed at it, room to place artillery where it could be fed. The 99th Division, new and stubborn, and the 2nd Division, scarred and stubborn, made the ridge their posture. The Germans hit and hit, probing for a seam that would let their armour pour west. Snow blurred the world into grey and white, but the strikes made black marks that could be targeted. Guns behind the ridge spoke as one instrument, registered and controlled until the shells fell with a rhythm infantrymen began to trust like a favourite hymn. The fight south and in the centre bent the map. The ridge did not bend. Later, men would call it a hinge. In the week it mattered. It was simply a place nobody left. To the south, one road through a pine corridor became famous for a different sort of stubbornness. Bastogne was a hub in a wheel of lanes. To hold it was to stick a hand into the spokes. The encircle and choke instinct is as old as war. The German ring closed fast, their armoured spearheads outrunning their own foot soldiers and their supply vans, accepting that speed was logic. American paratroopers moved toward the town like a reflex. They arrived carrying more confidence than winter gear, the kind of men who use humour to handle catastrophe and cigarettes to handle time. Tanks from a battered armour command added steel to their jokes. They set up a defence in pieces that became a perimeter the way a hasty camp becomes a home. Bastogne absorbed shelling and cold and rumours and replied with the sound soldiers love more than any speech. Artillery registered on good observers. The weather took sides with the attacker for days. Skies held low, heavy and smothering, and Allied air stayed on the ground or flew by braille. Ben Carter paced out the length of a wing with his hand on a cold skin and hated clouds like a personal enemy. Ground crews played cards in a wind that insisted on joining the game. Commanders measured time in hours lost to fog. Everything moved slower than it should, which meant that everything broke faster than planned. Trucks slid and stalled. Infantry dug into earth the consistency of iron. Tank engines made noises that were not listed in manuals. The German spearheads inhaled fuel and hope, exhaled exhaust and fear. Piper's column, an armoured fist that had planned to punch all the way to the Meuse and beyond, discovered that a road without shoulders turns into a trap when the defenders shoot for the lead and the tail. Bridges were blown. Fuel dumps were defended with a kind of ferocity that surprised even the men defending them. Civilians watched their front yards become artillery problems. In some places, men in stolen uniforms tried to sow confusion at crossroads, changing signs and asking questions with the wrong sort of accent. The Malmedy massacre, prisoners lined in snow and shot, did something to the air that week. It froze more than breath. Word travelled fast and true. There are places in a war where surrender is a currency and places where it is not honoured. Units adjusted their own arithmetic accordingly. More security on columns, more caution in taking hands up. Frank learned to love the sound of his own artillery the way a drowning man learns to love a rope. He carried extra rounds in pockets, kept chocolate wrapped against body heat until it softened enough to remind him that sugar is a kind of mercy. He lost the feeling in 2 fingers and spat curses that were less useful than the straw in his boots, but more satisfying. On a night when the sky was low and the tree line made shapes he hated, he watched a medic crawl toward a cry and wondered whether courage is a habit or a decision you make once and keep making without noticing. The next morning, he ate something from a can and could not taste it. He scratched a note to himself in the margin of the letter he had started in the quiet sector. If you come home, remember the sound of boots on frozen boards. In Bastogne, the encircled command received a formal invitation to surrender. The reply, short, unadorned, has been quoted so often its edges wore smooth. But in that moment, it was not a slogan. It was a dose of clarity. The men read it second-hand and grinned, not because they needed a phrase to hang their fear on, but because stubbornness prefers simple sentences. Days there felt like a winter of their own, air full of splinters, ground full of holes, hands full of tasks. Parachutes finally appeared when the sky remembered it could be blue, and C-47s came like a congregation, unloading bundles that contained everything from plasma to hope. Ben flew top cover for those runs, eyes on contrails that did not appear because cold eats trails, jaw tight until the landing strips were kissed by tires and lifted again. He watched flares rise out of Bastogne's bowl like ideas turned into light. When the weather broke, air power arrived with an appetite honed by a week of hunger. Fighter bombers found convoys and treated them as math problems they knew how to solve. Bridges behind the bulge were cut, crossroads burned. Tanks trying to creep under hedges stopped creeping and started burning. The heavy bombers, called in to crack attacks open, performed an industrial task that looked like geology repeating itself. Lines of explosions that drew across snow like dirt plow lines in summer, wrong season, same motion. Pilots learned to read the day in temperature and the way snow fogs a canopy. Ground controllers, exhausted and hoarse, learned to speak in syllables that survived static. The offensive's clock lost time in hours, then days. The Elsenborn Ridge held. Bastogne held. The shoulders on either side of the bulge were not broken. The German plan, brilliant at brainstorming scale, failed in its grievance with physics, fuel, distance, weather's patience. Kampfgruppen ran dry at crossroads that could not be bypassed. Drivers siphoned from abandoned vehicles and found the taste of gasoline became a metaphor they could not forget. Plans to overrun Allied depots found those depots guarded by men who had learned in Italy or Tunisia, or the hedgerows that ammunition is a kind of faith. Columns that had a schedule discovered they had a season, and winter was not theirs. Patton's Third Army, pivoting like a dock crane under orders, came up from the south through roads that scouts had already quietly prepared for. The relief of Bastogne did not arrive as a parade. It arrived as tanks nosing past wrecks, as infantry in white sheets, moving like ghosts with loud boots. The first handshakes on the road in were awkward, gloved, baffled. Men had to find words that would not cheapen the cost of either side's week. The siege did not end that day, not in the sense of shells going silent, but the town's breath changed. Frank watched a convoy roll by and leaned on a wall that had been designed to hold a roof, not a war. The northern shoulder pressed eastward by inches, then a mile at a time. Elsenborn still answered in full chords when the attackers tried again. The answer was always no. In the center, Piper's men abandoned vehicles and walked toward a line that had stopped moving west, heads up because their training did not include slumping. Civilians emerged from cellars with faces that made medics want to carry more than bandages. Snow softened into slush, then froze into ruts that kept stories written in steel overnight. Bodies were collected as duty, not ceremony. There's a way men speak when they are tired of counting the same two colors. It is a flat tone. It tells the truth without trying to make it more or less. Winter asked the highest price. It took toes first, and then took patience, then took particular friends with names no one will hear again, outside of kitchens where photographs are kept in drawers. It took clear judgment from some governments and gave it to others. It took the last of the German army's capacity to choose the time and place of any future blow in the West. When the line finally pressed back to where it had begun, and the bulge was a dent and then a memory, men looked at the calendar and realized it was the same winter. Season prolongs war differently than maps do. The river had been waiting the whole time. The Rhine is both obstacle and promise, a line drawn by water that armies write over with bridges. The Allied plan did not choose a single crossing. It made a list. The British and Canadians would press in the north, Americans along multiple points, learning from a winter that had punished single-bridged ambitions. Engineers rehearsed with pontoons in pools where ducks had once been the only thing that bothered the water. Amphibious tractors were counted like seats on lifeboats. Artillery registered on bank lines that had been photographed and memorized until the photographs might as well have been childhood maps. Sometimes history arrives unscheduled. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was supposed to be a question mark. Would it be blown before any river was touched? The answer, on a March afternoon, was not yet. The 9th Armored Division found it standing, crippled, mined, smoking, somehow there. The orders were not written in time. The decision was anyway. Infantry and tanks dashed onto the span under a sky being torn by flak and smoke, and a feeling that opportunity was as fragile as timber. German pioneers fired charges that snapped and banged. The deck shuddered but held. Men ran and lay flat, and then ran again. A tank nosed across and made a sound heavy enough to make the river seem briefly smaller. When the far bank was reached and a bridgehead scraped out of mud and surprise, the phone calls up, the chain had a breathless tone. The Rhine had been crossed not by a plan, but by a habit of saying yes. Frank crossed the bridge days later when the structure groaned under engineers' furious scabbing. He carried his pack away from the handrails because the river below seemed interested. He looked down anyway, because people always do, and the green water had the calm of something that has seen empires and prefers not to remember details. Behind him, pontoon bridges were going up, as if men had been born to lay them. German artillery found the span repeatedly. The bridge shook and then kept working, like an old man who refuses to leave the room just because someone slammed the door. When the bridge finally fell, days of abuse, one last shudder, the crossings did not stop. The river had been lost only as a symbol. The crossings existed now as a habit. Engineers had built redundancy into courage. The British crossed up north under curtains of artificial night and the kind of artillery program that looks like weather. The Canadians bled at the approaches to ports that would make the winter's logistics elegant at last. South of Remagen, US armies did a thing that would have been considered prideful in another year. They crossed the Rhine in multiple places as if to insult geography. The river, in photographs taken later, looks almost decorative. In memories it's much wider. When an army crosses a river that had been called a frontier for a generation, the shape of the war changes. The Ruhr, that industrial heart whose beating had been slowed by bombs for 2 years, still pulsed. It needed to be cupped and squeezed until its beats belonged to someone else. The encirclement that formed around it in April was both elegant and ugly. Elegant in the way 2 armoured pincers, north and south, met in a handshake that didn't need. Cameras, ugly in the way towns became chess pieces again, and civilians in cellars waited for somebody to tell them what happened outside. Field Marshal Model, a soldier whose profile might as well have been carved from concrete, looked at the pocket and saw its meaning. He dissolved his army by orders to save men who could be saved and then removed himself from a history that would have argued with him. The Ruhr surrendered in clusters and then in floods. The number of prisoners climbed into a vocabulary of astonishing. Hundreds of thousands. Columns longer than patience. A managerial challenge as much as a victory. American soldiers stood beside roadways that looked like craft fairs with weapons laid in neat, doomed rows, and felt something complicated. The end of a particular fear, the beginning of another. Ben's squadron hit road junctions that fed the Ruhr, then flew armed reconnaissance over columns of prisoners and civilians moving both directions, each eking out a claim on the same road. He learned to roll in on the last mission of the day as if it were the first, knowing that an engine does not care what hour it is and a gunner does not count how many times he has been surprised. He also flew a mission no training prepares a man for, escorting a general's inspection to a place where victory had turned into something else. Near Gotha, at Ohrdruf, and later at Nordhausen, the first camps encountered by American units revealed a category of truth that had not fit into anyone's world view. He circled above, while the general below walked between things that made words recoil. Later, he read that the general had insisted on bringing legislators and journalists to see, to smell, to make their stomachs know. Ben did not feel better for having been overhead. He felt a new kind of anger, not hot and righteous, but cold and unwilling to permit anyone to sand down the edges. Frank walked through a camp a week later, a different place with the same truth. He kept his eyes where they needed to be to help, but that set did not protect him. The smell made a filing cabinet in his mind jam. An old man took a spoonful of soup and tried to give it back. Frank refused it back and said, "Yours," twice. He spent an afternoon moving blankets and a morning burning, not documents, but mattresses. He looked at captive guards and discovered that his rage had no efficient target. That night, he wrote nothing in the letter he had been carrying since the Ardennes, because no words could make his hand start. He folded it and put it away, and knew that a blank page could sometimes be the only honest paragraph. Anna Miller read the cable that described one of these places in measured language that shook. She had been careful for years not to personalize the war so much that she would drown. This day she allowed herself drowning for an hour. She wrote a note to herself that she never showed anyone. When they say we exaggerated, remember the smell is not reproducible on paper. She followed the news about the orders to document and kept clippings in a separate folder, because even files need respect. Aiko typed copies of directives that would bring doctors into places that had not had enough air, even when the doors were opened. She sat afterward and stared at her fingers, surprised at their steady calm, and then later, at home, dropped a cup and let it break because edges felt honest. Jack Torres's job felt small next to all this, and therefore necessary. His ship shepherded tankers into Antwerp and Rotterdam in early spring, hulls that had to move lest an army slow and begin to hunger. Mines still haunted the channels. One newswire image of a blown bow put a weight in the stomach that did not lift until the harbour mouth was cleared like a throat. He listened to the radio and realized that the sea can be a mercy. Nobody builds camps on the ocean. He wrote to his mother and told her about the way the sun looks on grey water. He did not mention anything else. Robert Hale added an extra shift to assemble Bailey Bridge panels. There is something soothing about a bridge you can carry in pieces and build with a team that has more muscle than cynicism. He held a rivet in his palm and imagined a river under it. He signed off on crates marked for engineer battalions and allowed himself a rare smile that looked like relief, not satisfaction. Later, when the reports of Remagen came, he stood on a catwalk with a foreman who had a boy in the 9th Armoured, and they did not speak for a long time. Then the foreman said, "I hope nobody fell," and Robert said, "They always do." And the foreman nodded as if this answered something neither wanted to ask. The last weeks on the West Bank felt like a clock that had started to run fast. The Saar, the Moselle, the Rhine, the Ruhr, names that had been in dispatches for months, ticked by and changed from obstacles to locations. In towns that had been factories and were now ruins, civilians came out with hands up or hands working to rebuild a wall because hands prefer work. Units found stores of things nobody had names for and recorded them, and then people with better vocabularies arrived and named them and removed them or destroyed them. The air over the Ruhr went from smoke that meant output to smoke that meant endings. Elsewhere on the front, the British and Canadians and Poles broke across their sections of the river with a choreography that had taken months to rehearse and minutes to perform. In the north, the crossing resembled a theatre, lights controlled, curtains pulled at the right hour, lines read on cue. It did not make it less lethal. In the south, old cities that had seen emperors saw assault boats and white smoke and decided to add this to their ledger. Another army passing, each claiming that its cause was righteous, and for once, both halves of that sentence feeling true. Ben took one more look at the Rhine from above at dusk and saw it catch. The last light like a wire. He wondered how many men had thought of wires lately. Teletype ribbons, demolition caps, telephone cables, bridge cables, and realized that the war had become a compendium of ways to connect and sever. He trimmed his approach and called the tower and felt that calm that comes after the day's first adrenaline has left and the last has not yet arrived. Frank shared a cigarette with a man from another regiment who had fought at Elsenborn. The man said the ridge was just a hill, but it was their hill, and Frank said Bastogne was just a town. But it was their town, and both nodded as if to say, the geometry of home can be drawn with a pencil anywhere, provided your friends are within arm's length. He slept one night with his boots off and woke terrified until he realized the habit he had developed. Never both boots off could be surrendered for a minute. He did not make a speech about it. He just let his feet breathe. Jack's ship moored and took on fuel and water, both more precious than memory in a profession that depends on both. He washed his face and stared at himself and thought, "I look like someone older than I am." Then he laughed because everyone did. Anna wrote to a friend overseas and then crossed the letter out and wrote a shorter one because the first had tried too hard to be wise. She wrote, "We are ready to receive you," and nothing else. Aiko bought more stamps. Robert put his notebook in a drawer and promised himself he would not open it for a year after the war ended. He would break that promise 3 weeks after VE Day, because promises that ask you to forget are always fragile. The Battle of the Bulge did not end with a single insult to the enemy or a trumpet. It ended with an exhausted field receding under boots that wanted different ground. It ended with fuel tanks empty and banks full of shell casings, with a German army that had demonstrated bravery and craft, and then found that bravery without petrol equals surrender, with an Allied army that had demonstrated craft and then learned humility at crossroads. The crossing of the Rhine did not end the war. It ended the idea that the war had a sanctuary from arithmetic. The Ruhr pocket did not obliterate an enemy's will. It turned will into tired men, walking east to west under watch, many of them relieved to be obliged to live. The first camps conquered nobody. They instructed. They changed pronouns. We had been we and they for years. Now they became a particular set of faces that insisted on staying in our eyes when we closed them. Officers who had planned crossings and supply dumps turned to the immediate logistics of mercy. Calories measured in spoons, clothing measured in hours of warmth, delousing as an act of love, burial as an act of duty. Photographers did not need to be told to take pictures. They needed to be told to keep film dry. Writers who had trained themselves to turn events into sentences discovered a PID, new grammar, simple verbs, fewer adjectives, the courage to let nouns stand alone. Spring came on the Rhine like a truce. Trees budded as if armies had agreed to pause for leaves. Children in towns that had been choked with troops stepped into streets and rediscovered games that did not involve metal. Men who had not thought of fishing thought of it. Women opened windows and decided that the air could come back in. Bridges, temporary and permanent, carried trucks and tractors, jeeps and bicycles. The water moved at its own speed, unimpressed by history but not indifferent to it. Rivers keep what they see in their reflections. The winter had asked the highest price. The spring began to tally returns. The tallies were not neat. The accounts would be argued over for generations, as accounts always are when they involve lives and lies and the way a continent chooses to remember. But the arithmetic on the ground looked like this. West of the Rhine, Allied columns that had proved they could be denied. East of it, Allied columns that had proved they would resist denial. In pockets where the last resistance had meaning, it was reduced. In cities where the last memory had power, it was reclaimed. The march would go on to the Elbe and beyond, and a different army would meet them there on a river whose name had spent 20 years becoming a border. But for a small space in time, between snow hardened to steel and a river bridged by nerve, a nation and its allies did two hard things: survived a surprise and turned a line of water into a hallway. At night, under a sky that now allowed stars without interruption, Frank lay and listened for shelling and heard none. He thought about Bastogne and Elsenborn and Remagen as if they were rooms in a house he would later walk through with a guest and say, "That's where the ceiling leaked. That's where we put the stove. That's where we knocked down a wall." He did not feel triumphant. He felt allowed. Ben cleaned his goggles and put them in a case and label-taped it, because order felt like a way to honor those who had been consumed by disorder. Jack wrote the words "river crossed" on the back of an envelope and underlined them twice for no one. Anna switched off her lamp and walked home slowly because fast walking had begun to feel unnecessary. Aiko stopped at a flower stand and bought a cheap bouquet because cheap beauty was still beauty. Robert turned out the last light on the plant floor and left the hum to the machines cooling. In the morning, the hum would return, and men and women would again make things that went places and made life survive. Winter had placed its fee on the table. It had taken what it wanted. In return, it had given clarity. The river had given crossing. The pocket had given surrender. The camps had given a command that would last longer than any victory. Remember, the road ahead would ask other prices. But the men and women who had walked through this season, who had held the ridge, refused the ring, crossed the bridge, and cupped the heart of an enemy, now knew that distance is only cold until someone warms it with movement. From a river crossed and a continent closing its fists, the map swung back across an ocean where the final miles would be paid in heat and salt and ash. The endgame in the Pacific began as a return and a reckoning. The Philippines, reached by promise and planning, drew fleets into the largest naval battle human beings had ever tried to choreograph. Leyte's palm-lined beaches and rice fields were small on the map. The sea around them became enormous. The plan said, land an army, protect it, and sever the empire's artery to the south. The enemy's plan said, gather every ship left that could still carry shells, turn the sky into a weapon, and try to break history's neck in one last convulsion. Jack Torres stood on the steel ribs of a destroyer that had lived long enough to know different oceans. The air smelled of humidity and hot paint. From his radio room, he watched through a porthole as the invasion armada spread itself out, its logic visible even to a sailor. Transports where the soldiers slept, cargo ships that contained tomorrows, battleships and carriers like cattle dogs circling, destroyers like daggers close to the throat of any trouble. The run-in to Leyte went as rehearsed as such things can be rehearsed. Beaches were stained with the usual mixture: smoke, courage, confusion, improvisation, and then stabilized with the usual tools: bulldozers, MPs, chaplains, cribbing, cargo nets. The deeper fight arrived days later from every point on the compass. The Japanese fleet, divided into lures and fists, moved on Leyte like weather with intent. One force roared down toward Surigao Strait, another, the center, pushed through Sibuyan Sea toward San Bernardino, a third, the decoy carriers, flapped its wings in the north, lean on planes but fat with expectation that American admirals would chase what had once been the most dangerous silhouette afloat. In between, long grey shapes with pilots who had been told destiny looks like a vertical line on a plot board spiraled down on ships. Kamikaze was a word few in the fleet had said out loud before. Now the syllables travelled wide. At Surigao Strait, in a night that smelled of cordite and wet rope, an old textbook was taken from a shelf and read aloud. Crossing the T had been written about when fleets wore coal and proudly showed their sides. Here it was executed with radar hands and torpedo teeth. PT boats stung and probed. Destroyers slipped in and gave gifts nobody wanted. Battleships, some raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, fired with a weight that felt like theology. At dawn, the strait belonged to no one in particular, just to the dead and the current. But the American transports heard less danger in the day's tone. In Sibuyan Sea, the center force took a beating that made men write new entries in their private lexicons of disbelief. A battleship the size of a courthouse, bigger, shrugged into the water with a grace that was obscene because of what it meant. A giant had been drowned by dozens of smaller hands swarming from carriers. Ben Carter, who had learned to stitch targets in Europe with precision, flew here with the ocean's blue replacing the continent's patchwork, and found that a ship at sea is both enormous and terribly vulnerable if air owns the hour. He rolled in, pulled out, rolled in again, anti-aircraft claws reached up and scratched, the sky filled with black powder flowers and the smell of burnt paint. The center force reeled and then, in a move that would be debated and shrugged at in equal measure, turned back through the strait that had promised Leyte an armored nightmare. Night fell. The northern decoy carriers danced on the horizon with the flirt of someone who knows they are being watched. The next morning, a phrase from 100 years earlier regained combat pay. The sound of battle to the north. Carriers with very few planes aboard drew the attention of an American commander who had taught himself not to ignore temptation. North the fast carriers went, hunting the dream prey. South of that chase, east of Leyte, a ragged screen of escort carriers, the jeep carriers that lived to bring planes to beaches and bring wounded home, found themselves confronted by battleships and cruisers that had slipped through San Bernardino in the night like wolves through a fence. Taffy 3, a small name for a big courage, turned its light hulls toward the impossible and then made the impossible shareable. Jack's radio blared a tangle of call signs that sounded like prayer and sarcasm in equal measure. Destroyers with names few had memorized, tin cans with reputations not yet earned, charged into a line of dread that should have swallowed them. They made smoke, the good grey kind that lies and saves. They fired torpedoes at ranges that made ordnance officers nervous. They took hits and kept signals coming. Enemy in sight, closing, hit, still closing. An escort carrier's flight deck, little more than a long hallway, launched planes with bombs not designed for battleships, with ammunition not designed to make miracles, and pilots flew anyway. Pilots with empty racks dived just to make big ships duck. Ben heard one of their voices over a frequency that should have been calm and felt himself nod even before the pilot joked that he was out of bullets, but not of bravery. The destroyer Johnston, scarred and already half sinking, punched again and again at monsters. Hole and Samuel B. Roberts clawed at capital ships as if the ocean had turned upside down and given the small the leverage of the brave. Splinters and water-filled compartments meant for air, damage reports read like poetry. Forward engine room flooded, electrics jury-rigged, we're still here. The Japanese admiral who had been promised a feast saw smoke and audacity and reports of torpedoes and decided that ghosts and facts are indistinguishable when you can't count either clearly. His line turned away. Somewhere on the edges of the battle, a plane ditched, and the pilot climbed into a raft and laughed because laughter was safer than crying at the vastness of the sea. Leyte closed with a truth that would stain the water for months. The enemy had thrown steel and courage into the mouth of American protection and been chewed. The cost was terrible on both sides. The result was final in a way naval battles rarely are. The sea lanes to the south, oil, rice, rubber, began to belong more to submarines than to freighters. The empire's logistics were not severed in a day. They were put on hospice. The island war stepped right up to the homeland's edge after that, and the map shrank. Iwo Jima looked like a pockmark on the ocean's face, sulfur smoke, black sand that behaved like liquid, a volcanic cone standing like a mailed fist at one end. The argument for it was arithmetic, wrapped in an unkind terrain, fighter bases to escort long-range bombers, emergency landing fields for machines limping home with engines dying and wings punctured, a radar outpost whose destruction would lower alarms for the raids to come. The enemy's general, an officer who understood both honor and geometry, had turned the island into a hive, a lattice of tunnels and chambers, interlocking fields of fire, caves that breathed when shells hit the mountain. He had told his men their job was to make the Americans bleed in disproportion and to be clever in their dying. The landings started as most do, men in boats looking at a shore that looked back with contempt. The sand swallowed ankles, then calves. Tanks whose tracks had learned coral and mud discovered that Iwo's grit pulled like hands. Flags went up, coloured smoke telling planes where not to kill friends, and then went down under fire. Rifle companies that had practiced drill for this day found their knees hitting a black ooze that made crawling as slow as memory. The first hours were a mosaic of tiny losses and small gains. The mountain stared. Marines moved around its base, hugging a line of surf while the fleeing tide betrayed them and left them naked when they wanted to be covered. Frank DeLuca, still in Europe when this began, heard rumours of the place in letters that took weeks to arrive and months to make sense. His world was mud-frozen and then thawed. Theirs was cinder and smoke and the smell of rotten egg that lives in volcanoes. Yet a sentence in a letter from a boy he'd met on Saipan reached across oceans and made the geography irrelevant. We dig, and the island digs back. The climb up Suribachi was not a mountain conquest in the whittled book sense. It was a step, a crawl, a grenade lobbed into a hole, a flame that turned a cave's mouth into noise, a shot fired by a hand that could barely hold the rifle because of a day's shaking. When men reached the top, some cried and did not know they were crying. A flag went up on a piece of pipe that had been made for some other purpose. Men on the landing beaches looked up and saw cloth against sky and shouted because symbols rescue lungs. Later, a larger flag would go up, and someone would take a photograph that would live longer than many of the men in it. The picture would be beloved, and the island would not care. Iwo was not won when the flag stood. It was won by moving north, yard by unholy yard, through a defence that refused to collapse because it had not been designed to retreat. Casualties piled because the island forced it. Corpsmen and medics made new habits out of heroism, inking morphine on foreheads with gloves blackened by dust, dragging bodies out of places where Earth said no, ignoring the calculus that says a man who runs toward a wounded friend is a fool because it is true and irrelevant. The airfields, 2 and then 3, were conquered by inches but built in days, scraped flat by men who had been taught that speed means fewer funerals. For the next months, bombers that would have frayed into the ocean chose to land there on shredded tires with shot-up hydraulics, crews climbing out and kissing black grit they had learned to hate before they loved. Numbers would one day be argued over, stories were not. A pilot with oil in his eyes, stumbling off a wing and touching a runway with a hand, is not a statistic. The war reached a pitch at Okinawa that made even veterans stare at each other and decide to stop making jokes for a while. This was not a dot on the ocean, this was a prefecture, a place where families had names back to the 15th century. The landing beaches were generous, the welcome was not. The defenders had learned one lesson over and over: let the Americans come ashore, punish them when they are organized and extending, fight from a depth that cannot be seen from offshore. The line inland, across a spine of ridges and low hills, would become a belt that the attackers pulled at for weeks, the cloth refusing to tear until it did, one thread at a time. What made Okinawa different to sailors was the sky. Kamikaze became not an episode, but a weather pattern. Radar picket stations, destroyers and smaller ships strung like beads hundreds of miles around the island, lived in a zone where warning becomes martyrdom. You see it first, you take it first, you tell others to live. Jack's ship did picket duty twice. The first run brought planes in like hornets, each a man and a mission that wanted his ship to be a grave. Gunners learned to shoot not at planes, but at men who were flying their own funerals. Near misses were counted as failures. Hits were complicated, the target exploded, and fire on water behaved like a demon that had eaten gasoline. Once, on a grey afternoon that refused to brighten, a plane's wingtip skimmed the mast and carried away an antenna. The pilot's face was a colour Jack could not forget. Another day, a ship 2 stations away took a direct hit at sunset and burned with the awful beauty of a lantern until somebody smothered it with foam and courage. Hospital ships, painted white with red crosses that should have been as powerful as myths, were not always respected by pilots who believed the sky no longer had rules. On land, the typhoon of steel was not a metaphor to infantry. Artillery made air into iron filings. Mortars dropped with that hateful cough thump that announces hours of misery. Civilians were not just in the way, they were in the fight by presence and sorrow. Families hid in caves where air had trouble deciding if it wanted to circulate. Soldiers with loudspeakers asked those inside to come out. Propaganda and fear made some refuse. Tragedies played inside darkness while the line shifted outside by feet and then yards. The Shuri line, which was a string of overlapped positions more than a neat line, demanded days that turned into weeks and rains that turned into rivers inside trenches. Officers killed themselves rather than sign papers, doing with swords what history would have done with pens. Marines and soldiers kept moving forward and sideways, losing friends, keeping rituals stubborn enough to survive their own doubts. Ben flew cap, combat air patrol, over pickets and beaches, watching the sea write new scars on ships under attack, diving on dots that grew into planes too late to save the target, but not too late to make the next run costlier. He learned to tell in a second whether a pilot intended to live. He learned to hate a certain angle of approach that meant a full fuel load and a certain fearlessness. He learned to land with his hands steady and then sit on a crate and shake his head, like a man trying to dry his hair. He wrote to Robert Hale's plant from the wardroom once, a note that said simply, "The instruments you make behave like friends." At sea, numbers turned into a blur, but ships' logs can still list the days. One day, a raid slips through and finds a carrier. The next day, the radar net catches everything, and pilots in the ready room relax for 20 minutes and then pretend they did not. One night, a moon rises that makes everyone believe in luck again. The next morning, a storm shreds that illusion. A typhoon spun past the Ryukyus and reminded men that if human malice were not enough, the weather could compete. While the islands burned and smoked, the sky over the home islands filled with a different kind of fire. The air campaign shifted from high-altitude precision that was mostly an aspiration to low-altitude, nighttime conviction, streams of bombers loaded with fire instead of steel. Cities built of wood and paper and memory burned in ways industrial planners had not intended but could measure. Firestorm became a word that belonged on a meteorologist's board. Drafts pulled flames through neighborhoods the way a rumor runs through a town. The miles of blackened grid left behind looked like a map of the future for a week. Nothing, and then something growing where a corner had been. The men in the bombers came home with the smell in their hair and a quiet in their limbs. They told each other practical things, how to line up the run, how to keep formation in a maze of updrafts, and kept other things for themselves, for a day when somebody would ask under better light, why? The answer would never be simple. The sea, harnessed by submarines and mines, did the work of a strict parent. The blockade strangled, patient and thorough. Submarines lay under shipping lanes like gilt and waited. Freighters that had brought rice north and coal south ran gauntlets that no captain could pretend were luck. Loss rates climbed. Captains hugged coasts and found mines where they had hoped for safety. A mining campaign sown by fast, high-altitude bombers in the straits turned channels into suspicion. The empire's lungs lost volume. Factories worked, then stopped. Trains rolled, then halted for lack of fuel they could no longer steal from tomorrow. Civilians, who had always paid the invisible taxes of war, started paying in bones and breath. The ration cards, already thin, became theoretical. Aiko received a letter from a distant cousin in Honolulu who had lived on the island before the war and who now spent her days packing bundles for relief ships that would not be needed if the war ended soon. The letter said, without saying, that starvation is not politics, it is physics. Back in the United States, the tempo that had built the arsenal showed its last crescendo. Robert Hale stood on the catwalk, watching one final overrun for landing gear parts, and felt something like an ache. The knowledge that the machine he had helped run was reaching its last hard grind. He signed off on crates bound for island engineers who would throw pontoon spans and lay mast and mat the day after a landing. He approved more proximity fuses for ships on picket duty, because letters from the front said they were the difference between a plane that reaches a deck and a plane that reaches the sea. He pulled aside a toolroom wizard named Sam to ask whether they could shave 2 ounces off a bracket without it cracking. Sam said yes, and Robert smiled, because every ounce saved in the Pacific turned into an ounce of fuel for a fighter that might need one more climb. Anna Miller processed casualty lists she had learned to read between the lines. Missing at sea could mean a boy was clinging to a raft. Wounded, burns, could mean a hospital ship would carry souls who would learn a new mirror. She moved paperwork for training pipelines, carrier air groups rotating out, replacement pilots going west, hospital trains scheduled. She taped to her drawer a one-line note from a Navy nurse who thanked her for ensuring a shipment of plasma arrived before a convoy sailed. The bureaucrat's sacrament is a delivered box. Jack wrote home, about the sky's new habits, about the way alarms at Okinawa acquired their own grammar. He did not write about bodies in the water. He had learned that words collapse under certain weights. He did write once about a boy from Kansas who had learned to sleep on a coil of rope like a cat and who could, in a storm, keep his balance while pouring coffee for 3 shipmates clinging to luck. The next week, the boy died when a splinter from a hit on another ship went looking for a heart and found his. Jack tore up the letter with the rope anecdote and wrote a new one about the sea in the morning, about how it smells like a laundromat of God's shirts. His mother, reading it, believed he was becoming poetic. He was becoming silent. Ben guided crippled bombers toward Iwo on nights when the moon made a path he pretended was drawn just for them. He talked over the radio like a brother. Lower, good, now the wind's from your right, wheels only when ready, hold it, there. He heard in the exhausted thanks a sound he would carry into old age, the realization that a runway can be a prayer answered by men. He also escorted raids that wrote the harshest sentences war can write, and he learned to live with the 2 kinds of ink. On Okinawa, the land campaign closed like a fist, finally finding a grip that holds. The ridge lines that had been stair steps became shoulders men could rest on for a minute. The last defenders, directed by officers whose understanding of their obligation did not include surviving defeat, vanished in explosions they detonated for themselves. Civilians emerged from caves, not sure whether light was an ally. A man walked out, holding a goat like a child. A woman walked out, holding a child like bread. An American medic handed a candy bar to a 5-year-old who did not know what sweetness meant anymore, and who learned and who cried, and then who laughed. And the medic turned away because adults cry properly only once a day at war. The tally at Okinawa taught a new arithmetic even to those who had done this before. Ships sunk in single digits that felt like double. Ships damaged in dozens that felt like hundreds. Planes lost, pilots gone, soldiers and marines with faces that turned 40 in a month. civilians in numbers that made a chaplain's mouth dry when he tried to say, out loud, "We're doing our best." The cost, counted honestly, was the closest the Pacific came to Europe's worst weeks. The lesson, for planners studying maps far from the screams, was stark. If this is the price at the doorstep, what will the living room cost? Back home, rationing eased in some places and tightened in others, as if the government itself were a housewife at a pantry with guests arriving unannounced. War bonds had faces now, boys on crutches at train stations, girls returning to munitions plants to collect final pay slips. A widow at a window deciding to move the photograph to a different table to see if that would change the ache. Factories kept their hum even as managers removed overstaffed shifts carefully, like stitches from a wound mostly healed. Robert attended a ceremony for the last bomber from one line and said nothing in his speech about endings. He talked about maintenance manuals rewritten in plain language and about the habit of quality that would, he promised, outlive the flags on the walls. Aiko collected clippings that were hard to collect. Tokyo at night under fire. Yokohama's docks turned to ladders of shadow. Nagoya's factories unroofed by the morning after. She placed them in a folder labeled simply Cities. She added to the folder a pencil drawing sent by a cousin in Chicago. A child's attempt to imagine what a faraway city looks like when it burns. All red crayon and black streaks, a stick figure holding another stick figure's hand. She sometimes took the folder out and looked at one picture and then put the folder away. A ritual that made no practical sense and yet kept her able to type another order. Jack, whose ship survived the picket line through luck and skill and the selflessness of men whose names will never be known beyond a corner of a bar, steamed away after the island was declared secured and watched the coastline shrink. He felt a fatigue that did not answer to sleep. He dreamed in alarms and deck angles. He counted days with a superstition he had made as a boy. Every seventh day is safe. And he no longer believed it, and he still counted. The sea told him nothing except that it would be there after him. Ben learned that a squadron's silence when a name is read is a kind of organ note. He listened and later, years later, would still hear it in grocery stores when the fluorescent lights hummed just so. He folded his goggles into their case and wrote on the case a name that was not his, and then scratched it out, because talismans are disloyal if you think too much about them. The empire's imports had withered to a trickle. Food moved by bicycle more than by rail. Ships hugged coasts and hit mines and sank in waters where fishermen cursed them for stealing fish with their bodies. Coal travelled in sacks on men's backs. Steel breathed only when the power stayed on for an hour that felt like a gift. Scarcity began to instruct policy as clearly as any memo. History has a way of arriving not as a speech, but as an empty shelf. And still the islands were there, a reach away from the home beaches. Small names that had made men older, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, turning into launch pads for machines that could cross the map and come back. The fighter bases at Iwo poured escort into the sky that guarded these machines. The Navy's ring of hulls strained in every direction, north against coastal convoys, west against mines, south against weather, with picket lines that were now picket fences. The Army and Marine divisions counted their men and discovered that half their platoons were new faces again. Every division prayed in its own way, some with chaplains, some with humour, some with cleaning rituals that made rifles so clean it felt like sanity. Plans for an invasion of the main islands moved forward with an optimism that came only from necessity, and a dread that came only from experience. At the edge of the home islands, the war burned hottest. On one side of the flame, mothers taught children how to hide from fire as if it were weather. On the other, sailors counted seconds between radar blips and impact. Between them, air wrote sentences no one wanted to read. The blockade continued to squeeze without drama, which is to say it was decisive. The raids continued to burn without rhetoric, which is to say they were brutal. The island fights had taught both sides to expect skill from the enemy and to suspect mercy from no one but individuals. Individuals still delivered it sometimes, a sailor reaching into water for a downed pilot who wore a red circle on his sleeve. A marine giving water to a man in a cave, then backing away and letting him drink in private. A farmer in the Ryukyus hiding a child under his coat in a slit trench and daring anyone to say a word. Frank, reading what letters he could in a tent in Germany, understood that his mouth would stay shut when a man who had been on a radar picket in the Pacific wanted to talk, and that he owed that man his quiet attention. He carried the habit home when home finally arrived, and for the rest of his life he would not interrupt sailors. Robert, finishing his last tour of the plant before schedule boards were wiped clean, touched a sheet of aluminum and felt for the first time since 1941 that he would have to teach himself how to walk without the metronome of a war. Anna, posting a final set of orders for sailings that would thread to islands now measured in hours, wrote one extra note to herself. Whatever comes next, remember how fast we learned when we had to. Aiko folded a letter she had never intended to mail, addressed to no one in particular, thanking them for doing the job for so long, and put it in the drawer with clippings and ration books, and a photograph of a woman with a rivet gun laughing at something said out of frame. The Pacific endgame had the feel of a storm that has exhausted itself on the land it envied. The waves were still high. The clouds still carried rain. But beneath them, airfields existed that had not existed. Ships floated that had not floated. Men lived who would not have lived if everything had been done slower or worse. The price had been reckoned in steel and blood and fire and the thinning of a nation's patience. The last calculation, the one that would be presented in August, had not yet been made public. But the numbers were all there, in ledgers written in salt and ash. Fleets bled to the last. Islands won at a cost that trembled in the voice of anyone who tried to say it. Skies turned into factories of flame, seas turned into deserts for shipping, a ring closing around, cities that could not feed themselves, a door to the home islands that could now be knocked on by men who had learned to keep knocking until the hinges gave. And so the chapter ended with a heat that made maps fade. On a black beach whose sand still stuck to boots. On a ridgeline where rain still filled foxholes and cats still hunted in ruined houses. On a picket line where a destroyer still idled, eyes on the sky. In a factory where the last bracket was stamped. In an office where the last telegram was folded. Everywhere, hands paused and breath was held because the next choice would either spare or spend a continent's future. From black sand and burning seas, a different fire gathered inland. Quiet, mathematical, and about to change what end could mean. Long before any desert flashed white, the story began with a fear written on chalkboards. In the late 1930s, physicists followed neutrons like campers follow sparks in dry grass. A heavy nucleus could split, fission, when struck just so, releasing energy and more neutrons. A recipe for a chain reaction if the material were arranged and purified correctly. The science was breathtaking and frightening at once. Here was a door that opened when hit, and behind it was a room full of matches. Europe's political weather turned that worry into urgency. Letters were written, laboratories that had delighted in purity pivoted to secrecy. What had been a conversation among colleagues became a program with fences. Two paths formed almost at once because nature is generous but not simple. Uranium, dug from Earth with patience and chemistry, exists mostly as U-238, a patient isotope that does not readily split. The useful sliver is U-235, rare enough to make geologists smirk. A fraction of a percent in mined ore. Separating the two became an industrial riddle, how to sort atoms that behave like twins in most contexts. Plutonium, by contrast, is not dug at all, it is bred. If neutrons are fed to U-238 inside a reactor, new atoms are born, Pu-239 among them, an element that didn't exist on any human scale before the 20th century. So the project chose to pursue both at once, purify uranium until enough U-235 was at hand, build reactors that turn uranium into plutonium, and then learn to pluck the newborn out of a chemical soup. It was a bet on redundancy, because failure on either road would be unforgiving. To make any of this real, the United States built cities that didn't appear on maps. In Tennessee, where the hills muffle sound and the rivers feed power plants. A fenced valley filled with alphabet. At Oak Ridge, 3 parallel answers tried to pull U-235 from its ocean of U-238. One answer used whirling magnetic fields to bend ions, calutrons inside the Y12 complex, great copper-throated machines that drank electricity and spit out enriched product in grams that felt like treasure. Another answer pushed uranium hexafluoride gas through barrier after barrier, gaseous, diffusion at K25, trusting that lighter molecules move a hair faster, and that a hair multiplied 10,000 times becomes a beard you can count. A third, stacked in towers, used heat, thermal diffusion at S50, less efficient alone, useful as a prelude. Trains brought in ore, pipes hummed. Women in slacks and men with slide rules stood watch over gauges whose needles had been calibrated to the fate of cities they would never see. Far to the northwest, where the Columbia River trips over basalt and carries yards of water a second, Hanford raised graphite temples to feed neutrons into uranium, a tranquil description for a fierce fact. The first large reactors, piles they were called, turned quiet rods into hot logic. When irradiated fuel came out the back, crews in white broke it down in chemical canyons the size of stadiums, dissolving, filtering, precipitating, coaxing plutonium from a stew with the patience of a gold washer and the precision of a watchmaker. Everything there smelled faintly of river, solvent, and ambition. Men joked to keep steady hands. Women learned procedures that made chemistry feel like ritual. Plutonium was born glowing only in metaphor, but the reality was no less astonishing. A metal no one's grandfather had held now sat in a glove box wearing the weight of a war. In New Mexico, where sky goes on for miles and mesas keep secrets, Los Alamos tried to make theory a device. Scientists whose names had once been footnotes in journals now wrote requisitions for high explosives. 2 designs walked in step at first, then parted. The simpler gun-type design would slam one mass of U-235 into another until together they crossed a threshold and the chain reaction ran away productively. Uranium's quirk, the relative purity of U-235 once separated, made that approach plausible. Plutonium, however, arrived with a hitch. Reactor-bred plutonium carries an isotope, Pu-240, that spits neutrons too readily. A gun would assemble too slowly. The chain reaction would start early and sputter rather than roar. The answer was implosion. Surround a plutonium core with carefully shaped charges, detonated so uniformly that the sphere collapses on itself, density jumping, neutrons trapped, the reaction racing to completion before quirks can interrupt. That sentence is easy to write. Making it true required a marriage of arcane physics and practical craft no army had ever arranged. Explosive lenses, blocks of fast and slow high explosive, stacked so that their detonation fronts curve the way a mirror bends light, had to be formulated, cast, machined and fired with a simultaneity that laughs at sloppy habits. Wires had to rendezvous in microseconds. Detonators, little hammers of fire, had to strike as one, regardless of weather or mood. In dusty canyons and winter pines, crews improvised laboratories and then demanded they behave like factories. Tests bloomed, spheres buried, gadgets dropped, diagnostics designed by people who had once argued about particles and now argued about machining tolerances. A radioactive lanthanum test, smuggled into the desert in small artillery shells, taught experimenters how fast matter could move when pushed by an invisible hand. The work was dangerous, exacting, exhausting. It also had the giddiness of discovery. Young men and women rode trucks up mountain roads to cafeterias where commuters discussed neutron reflectors over eggs. By mid-1945, the pieces were ready to be assembled, not just in theory, but in steel and alloy. To prove the implosion design would work, before trusting it over a city, the team built a device in the Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead, basin. The name was unhappy poetry. They raised a tower, bolted on lenses, nested tamper and core, threaded cables into bunkers dug like prairie dog towns. Before dawn, the desert felt like an animal holding its breath. The switch was thrown. Light arrived first, too much of it, and even men who had calculated yields flinched from a sun unannounced. Heat came after, and the sound last, flattening grass and ideas in a radius measured more by astonishment than miles. Where the tower had been stood a crater and a new shade of green glass. Some present thought of scripture because human brains reach for old words when presented with new facts. Others filed numbers, as good scientists do, and then sat down quietly and told jokes they wouldn't remember. In that light, two wars briefly touched, the one still being fought island by island, and the one that could be ended by a device carried under a plane. While the desert made its confession, Washington argued in offices where the furniture had heard lesser debates. The president, new to this burden after an April that had reshuffled history, took briefings that compressed years of secrecy into hours of responsibility. Advisors framed choices always with caveats. The interim committee, civilian and military, scientific and political, considered targets and meanings. A demonstration on an uninhabited site with observers invited. A warning shot coupled with ultimatum. A use that would shock a militarist government into surrender without granting them time to reposition, stall, or ask for better terms. Army and Navy voices spoke from different doctrinal continents. Some in uniform believed blockade and bombardment were already doing the job, that surrender could be achieved without crossing a moral boundary that could never be uncrossed. Others, looking at casualty estimates for a mainland invasion, saw graves stretching over 2 calendars and wanted a short, brutal end. The scientists were not a chorus. Some petitioned for a demonstration that would preserve conscience and achieve effect. Others argued that only the unmistakable demonstration of power over a city would crack a cabinet insulated by myth and fear. In every recommendation was a guess about another nation's soul. There was also a clock set in Moscow. Agreements made in quiet rooms had promised a Soviet entry into the war against Japan after victory in Europe and after the Red Army regrouped in the Far East. When that offensive came, it would rearrange Northeast Asia in a week. For some decision-makers, this was a lever. End the war before Soviet armies occupy space that will later be argued over in peace. Demonstrate a weapon that will frame not only surrender in the Pacific, but the shape of the next century. For others, it was a cruelty made necessary by another cruelty. A war already fed by firebombing and blockade would now be accelerated by a weapon that made adjectives fail. On paper, targets were debated as if they were ideas. Cities with military industry intact, with geography that would display blast effects clearly, with limited existing damage so that the new wound would be legible to planners and politicians alike. Places with psychological weight. Hiroshima sat at a river delta, army headquarters nestled among factories and wooden neighborhoods, a city that had been spared in prior raids, in part because it was being saved for this calculus. Kokura, Kyoto, Nagasaki, each came on and off lists as sensitivities and wind patterns and arguments, war grooves. Censors and cultural advisors raised concerns about shrines, about history, about optics. The final list reflected not only strategy, but the fallibility and urgency of people making choices too large for any single desk. In late July, Allied leaders issued a declaration from a conference city on the Elbe: surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. Words that must have sounded theatrical to a cabinet in Tokyo that had outlived so many threats, and terrifying to civilians reading between the lines. The declaration left the emperor's status ambiguous, a pivot for hardliners who preferred ruin to a surrender they could not choreograph, and for moderates who believed survival of the throne could mean survival of a nation's soul. In mountain caves and bombed ministries, Japan's elite argued, some with memories of responsibility, some with debts to ideology. On the morning of August 6th, a small group of aircraft crossed the coast of Honshu under conditions so ordinary that air raid sirens stayed silent. The lead was a B-29 stripped of everything not required for range and purpose. In its bay, a slender gun-type device slept, its uranium ready, its fuses obedient, its casing innocently nicknamed. Weather planes had gone ahead, instruments, planes followed. The city below shook itself into a workday. Streetcars rattled. A man read a newspaper aloud to a friend who could not read. Children carried buckets to fire brigades, a routine taught by months of nights. At a height where contrails are often born, a switch closed, a bomb released, and gravity introduced it to air. The blast began with light, as at Trinity, but now there were faces to receive it. In the first second, a sphere of heat made physics intimate. Wood ceased to be wood, paper learned to be flame, human skin recorded the pattern of fabric in blisters, and then lost that pattern in worse. A shockwave slapped walls into dust, and dust into air. The city's rivers briefly boiled at their edges. In minutes, fire found fire and learned to walk on its own wind. A whole exists in such moments that statistics cannot comfort. The device did what it had been designed to do. It destroyed a nucleus of military capacity and an ocean of civilian life in the same instant, because matter does not know uniforms. In the crew cabin, professional calm did its duty until a light they could see in their bones made even military men speak like boys meeting a thunderclap. The aircraft turned and pointed its nose toward a base where debriefing would consist of numbers and something else, unrecorded. News traveled along wires and across oceans the way news does, too slow for the stunned, too fast for the unprepared. Ben, stationed at an outfield where fighters had been escorting raids and shepherding damaged bombers home, heard the announcement on a radio that suddenly seemed smaller than the voice coming out of it. He walked outside and looked at the sky that was the same shade it had been an hour before and found it hard to match color to consequence. Jack, in a wardroom, stared at a piece of toast until a shipmate took it from his plate and laughed, then turned the laugh into silence when they both pictured a harbor across an ocean where water might now be reflecting a different kind of morning. Anna read the coded cable that would become a press release and tried to make the adjectives honest without making them fictitious. Aiko, whose drawer of clippings had always left her divided between pride and worry, sat at her kitchen table and let her hands remember the feel of ration books, while her mind tried to imagine a city that sounded like some of the places her grandparents had described in stories. Robert looked at a part on his desk, a bracket that had passed inspection for a plane that might have flown a different kind of mission, and felt the arrogance of steel turn to humility. The Soviet Union entered the war on August 9th, exactly as agreed, exactly at the point of maximum diplomatic consequence. Red Army formations surged into Manchuria, swatting aside armies that had been starved by blockade and bled by years of attrition. The strategic equation in Tokyo changed in a day. The idea of brokering surrender through Moscow vanished. The spectre of partition appeared. That same day, a second bomb, carried under names and numbers that felt like talismans, approached the southwest. The crew hoped for a primary target, a city kept intact for clarity. Weather and haze had their say. The plane turned toward a secondary whose geography was a bowl, a place where blast would echo. An implosion device, more efficient by science and more indifferent by nature, fell through brief clouds. A monastery prayed. A river valley held its breath. Light returned, and with it, the awful results that are more similar than the planners like to think. A blow to industry, to workforce, to neighborhoods that produce both. A flattening, a fire, a medical nightmare that would teach men in white about burns and radiation and sorrow, in combinations their textbooks had been too polite to imagine. Inside the Japanese government, the debate that had stretched across months turned into hours. The Supreme War Council split evenly between those who argued for one last condition, one last battle to improve terms, one last demonstration of resolve in hopes that the enemy would suddenly become gentle, and those who had seen enough to understand that resolve had already been displayed and that further demonstration would be murder thinly disguised. The emperor, a man raised within rituals that could make a person feel like a symbol more than a soul, chose, for perhaps the first time in modern memory, to exercise personal authority in a way that cut across military habit. Acceptance of the Allied terms, with clarification about the throne's survival, would be announced. Men who could not reconcile duty with defeat reached for knives and plans. A palace coup tried to stop a record from being played, a literal record, voice to be broadcast, that would tell a nation what no nation wants to hear. The plot failed in ways that would make playwrights nod. Confusion, courage by minor officials, doors opened at the right moment. A recording hidden in a basket of women's things. At noon on August 15th, radios crackled with a voice that spoke in diction older than most listeners' ears. Words that did not contain the word surrender, but contained all its weight. Mothers held children. Soldiers stood in courtyards and stared at their boots. A country inhaled the future like smoke. The choices in Washington were recorded in memos and diaries that would fuel arguments for decades. The strategic logic looked clean to those who used maps. An ending that spared an invasion whose casualty projections ran into hundreds of thousands for the invader and far more for the defended civilians. An ending that anticipated and perhaps bounded Soviet influence in Asia. An ending that matched a promise issued at Potsdam. The moral logic looked stained to those who used photographs. Charred paper masks where faces had been. Shadows impressed on steps, skin, eyes. Scientists who had argued for demonstration wrote later about remorse and necessity, and sometimes about the war they thought they were shortening in Europe when they began, and about the war they ended in Asia when they finished. Military men who had watched cities burn from conventional raids insisted the bombs were a continuity, not a step beyond. Naval officers who believed blockade could have strangled poison out of the empire without the bombs found their case weakened by time and strengthened by conscience. Soldiers, who had shot their way across beaches and hills, wondered how many of their friends were alive because of 2 mornings. The question of alternatives sits in that August like a chair never occupied. A demonstration on an uninhabited island with Japanese observers present. Would it have persuaded hardliners who told themselves air power was bluff, and who had already convinced themselves that firebombing did not produce surrender, only ruins? A wait for Soviet armies to take more ground and make pronouncements more persuasive? Would it have saved lives in Tokyo only to extinguish others in Hokkaido or Korea and leave a different century to manage? A rewriting of surrender terms to guarantee the emperor's place? Would it have preserved dignity early enough to avoid cities consumed? In reality, what happened is what happened. 2 devices, 2 mornings, 1 week, a voice on the radio, and then something like quiet that for many people felt like a new kind of noise. Surrender took ritual form on September 2nd in a bay that had known many flags. Battleships rode at anchor under a sky that chose at last to be benign. Delegations walked across a teak deck that smelled faintly of oil and sunlight. Papers were placed on a table with a green cloth. Pens were used that had been selected for symbolism. Commanders spoke sentences designed to bind wounds and flex authority, to open the next chapter while closing this one. Jack stood on the edge of a formation where hats made waves and watched the stroke of signatures and understood, though he would not have said it this way, that history is sometimes a clerk's job. Nearby, ships' whistles answered each other like a city celebrating a parade. Far away, on rail sidings, men in striped exhaustion climbed out of boxcars where they had learned to sleep standing, and on Pacific beaches, other men walked into water and felt it as more than a medium. Somewhere in the Marianas, a pilot who had expected to fly one more raid sat on a crate and wrote a letter he could not have written last week. The choices rippled instantly out of their moment. Prisoners of war on both sides came home, or, if they could not, were at least counted and mourned with names. Civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki began pilgrimages to clinics where doctors knew too little and learned fast. Japanese bureaucrats registered births and deaths with hands that shook. American factories began to miss the hum that had united them. Managers looked at peacetime orders with gratitude and anxiety. Scientists returned to campuses and looked at blackboards with suspicion, as if equations could lie. A handful stayed within fences to continue work, now called by a new name, weapons with timetables measured not by targets, but by politics. Anna processed orders for occupation units and found, unexpectedly, that she needed her old habits more than ever. Kindness in margins, precision in commas, the willingness to argue for a second hospital train when the first would not do. She wrote a memo that recommended more translators be hired not only for accuracy, but for decency. Aiko listened to the emperor's voice in a recording played days later in California, a double echo, his words and the phonograph's hiss, and wept for a country that had forced her family into camps, and for another country that had taught her to love paperwork because it could keep people alive. She made a scrapbook page with 2 images, a riveter laughing and a Torii gate standing in a city that no longer did. Robert walked through a quiet plant and heard the machines cooling like cicadas, and wondered what all this ingenuity would make next, and whether anyone would ask craftsmen to do anything so terrible and so arguably necessary again. Ben flew one last escort over ships carrying men home and realized he had spent 2 years turning fuel into time. He banked and saw islands that had once been skulls and now were commas. He thought of the desert where light had come at once, and of cities where light had come all at once again. And he did something he had not done since he was a boy. He said a prayer without words. Frank boarded a transport with boots that had worn 3 continents, and learned, when a sailor shouted, "Land ho!" that his heart could still skip like a child's. He saw newspaper racks in a port and stopped, stunned by headlines that made his war feel both larger and small. The moral complexity did not stay in 1945. It moved forward with every year that followed. The bombs ended one war and began an age in which every political crisis carried a shadow it had not carried before. Children would practice crouching under desks for weapons much larger than the ones carried in 1945. Diplomats would learn sentences that could cool hands reaching toward buttons. Scientists would petition and advise and regret and insist. Historians would tally and retally, argue casualty projections against actuals, debate intentions against outcomes, weigh imperial cabinet's stubbornness against people's suffering, and none of it would return the dead or make the living entirely comfortable with what saved them. The phrase "last resort" would be tested, redefined, abused, and sometimes honored. But in August and September of 1945, men and women who did not have graduate seminars to attend had simpler tasks. They found bodies and buried them. They found children and fed them. They freed prisoners and taught them to sit down. They carried stretchers up stairwells that had lost their stairs. They wrote letters no one wanted to receive, and also letters no one had expected to be allowed to receive. They shook hands that had no good words to go with them and settled for nods that said, "alive." On a Missouri deck, cameras clicked because we do not know how to tell ourselves that something happened without a picture. On a hillside in New Mexico, green glass was crushed under boots and collected in vials as if souvenir could be a prayer. In Tokyo, officials signed the end of one world and the beginning of another. In Washington, a president slept and woke and knew that from now on, the red phone in any office anyone might ever occupy would always be redder because of what had been proven possible. Power to end a war and begin a century. That was the exchange offered and taken. It was not fair. Nothing about 1939-1945 had been fair. It was final in a way only physics can be. It was also provisional in a way only politics can be, because endings in history are always beginnings wearing makeup. The uranium and plutonium paths had done more than race each other to the goal. They had built roads everyone would travel forever after, whether they wanted to or not. The cities with new names, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, would become chapters in civics and cautionary tales in sermons. The cities with old names, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, would become prayers and arguments and lanterns floating down rivers on summer nights. Jack would always taste metal in the back of his throat when someone said August. Ben would pat the goggles case and not remember why until the day arrived once a year, and he found himself sitting down without deciding to. Anna would keep her memo about translators pinned under a magnet for decades, not because the order had been wise, which it had, but because it had taught her that the exactness of words can be a kind of mercy. Aiko would take her scrapbook down sometimes and show a grandchild not the mushroom cloud. She would not use that picture, but a photograph of a nurse bending over a child in a doorway. And she would say, "Look how hands can be good." Robert would give a lecture to engineering students about first article inspection, and when a question about responsibility came, he would answer in the only way he could. Do your work so well that when someone uses it for good, it will not fail. And when someone uses it for evil, the failure will not be the fault of your workmanship. Then spend your life trying to push the world toward the first and away from the second. The project had been a sprint built on a marathon. The choice was a hinge creaking on 2 centuries. Behind it lay factories, beaches, convoys, radios, code rooms, graves, flags, telegrams, ration books, and a desert at dawn. Ahead lay an age with new verbs: data, annihilate, proliferate, verify. The men and women who had lived through the war didn't need those verbs yet. They needed to sleep and to find potatoes and to decide whether to go to church again. They needed to write to people they had promised to write. They needed to attend weddings and stand at headstones and forgive themselves for being happy. And history needed to turn its page, soggy with tears and rain, crisp with new ink, into whatever comes after a paragraph like this. From the desert's white flash and the emperor's voice on the radio, history exhaled, and then began counting. Axis defeat looked simple on a parade map. Arrows converging, dates, neat signatures on tables the color of ceremony. The ledgers that sat behind the lines were messy and would remain open for generations. In Europe, a continent of ruins tried to stand up straight. Germany's surrender, signed in a French schoolhouse under fluorescent light and fatigue, closed one account and opened a dozen others. Displaced persons by the millions, cities without roofs, factories without power, borders that had been redrawn as if history were a blackboard. In the Pacific, surrender arrived in a harbor so wide it felt like an amphitheater. Paper changed hands. Flags shifted. The sun rose on a bay that had seen more grey hulls than words could name. The war had ended twice, once on each side of the world, and neither ending had the cleanliness of a period. Both felt like commas. Tallies tried to hold what cannot be held, tens of millions dead, many without graves. Famine that followed armies like a loyal dog. Epidemics that reminded the survivors that biology ignores politics. The numbers were so large that even the men who had learned to count tons and sorties found them numbing. Teachers later would struggle to teach what happens when arithmetic outgrows empathy. Civic clerks discovered that a death certificate weighs the same whether it records a soldier who fell in Ardennes snow or a child who died in an Osaka cellar. Mothers discovered that a folded flag and a photograph on a mantle do not fill a chair. Fathers learned that the sound of a door at night can still make a heart leap years after the door will never open for the person who is gone. Occupation replaced invasion in Tokyo. General headquarters took over a hotel and turned it into a government with ashtrays. Japan, stunned by defeat, learned the grammar of directives. Disarmament, demobilization, democratization, each a verb that had to be bent into practice. Soldiers stacked rifles that had been the measure of manhood. Officers signed papers that felt like surrender, written again in smaller font. Bureaucrats who knew how to move forms learned how to move laws. Censorship loosened enough for reality to get in. A constitution was written in compressed time, a document with bones from many places and a heart that promised renunciation of war. An impossible promise that a nation would spend decades learning how to understand. Land reform began with surveyors walking fields where families had arranged property by memory, not map. Women formed lines at polling places and discovered the odd privilege of the stub of a pencil. Aiko read news bulletins that combined civics and contrition in sentences that felt both foreign and necessary. She took down notes from broadcasts and mailed clippings to relatives with translations in the margins. Her own country, United States, worried aloud about spies and then hired interpreters by the busload and leaned on Nisei intelligence units to make occupation humane and efficient. The irony was thick and, for many, unbearable. Aiko turned it into work. She wrote to a friend still in the desert camp and enclosed a newspaper photograph of a Japanese-American lieutenant standing on a Tokyo street talking to a shopkeeper with a smile that might have been history forgiving itself for a second. The letter came back with a note. The camp had closed. The address was wrong. Please forward. There was nowhere to forward to. Aiko put the envelope in her drawer of saved things and wrote on it, "Find." In Berlin and a dozen other German cities, the reckoning took a different form. Trials. Uniforms were traded for suits. Defendants sat behind glass and tried on the expression of explanation. Nuremberg's courtroom carried microphones and translators' booths, evidence that language itself had become a tool for justice. The indictment was a new genre: crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, answered with exhibits that had been gathered by soldiers who cursed while photographing, by correspondents who vomited behind barns and then wrote, by refugees whose memories became sworn testimony. Judges from 4 nations tried to teach a world how to say never again in law, not just in sermons. The trials could not match the scale of the crimes. Nothing could. They could inscribe, in records that would outlive everyone present, a set of lines that must not be crossed without consequence. A few defendants insisted they were only cogs. Others wore defiance, like a last uniform. Some stared at the table, naked of rhetoric. Sentences were pronounced. Gallows creaked. The archive grew. In Tokyo, a tribunal took shape with similar trappings and different currents. Here the arguments braided empire and strategy, domestic politics and personal responsibility, atrocities in Nanjing and experiments in laboratories that had traded microscopes for knives. The emperor was not in the dock. This would shape debates for the rest of the century. Generals argued about orders. Bureaucrats debated necessity. Lawyers attempted to cut clean lines through thick fog. The courtroom's air smelled of cigarettes and ink, and the collective fatigue of men trying to make the past obey logic. The rulings would never satisfy everyone. They would at least name things: forced labor, mass murder, aggression. They would say aloud, for a record, that nations can be held to standards even when those standards are written after the fact and with trembling hands. Veterans came home the way tides come in waves, not all at once, and each wave slightly different. Frank DeLuca stepped off a train with a duffel that had learned Europe's mud. He hugged his mother too hard and apologized with a grin that looked like a scar healing. He stood on a street that had not been bombed and was almost angry at the niceness of sidewalks. He learned that sleep in a quiet room can be a kind of battle when a mind expects artillery to announce midnight. He accepted a beer from a neighbor and later, alone, poured half of it down the sink because he did not trust the way his hands felt around a bottle. He found work slower than he had been promised, and then, thanks to a law passed while he was away, found school instead. The GI Bill took shape in No. 2 pencils and registrar's forms. Tuition paid, stipends disbursed, a seat in classrooms where professors tried to fit the world that had exploded into lectures of 50 minutes. Colleges grew not just in size but in purpose. Democracy sprouted student IDs. Ben Carter's homecoming arrived at night. He landed at an airfield where the wind smelled like dirt, not salt, and someone clapped once and then decided clapping felt silly, and then everyone clapped anyway. He walked into a house where his mother had laid a quilt across the back of a chair as if quilts were orders that must always cover someone. He drove carefully for an hour the next day and then pulled over and waited for the urge to scan the horizon to pass. It did not pass. He walked to a field outside town, lay on his back, and watched cloud and contrail and bird share the sky without trying to kill each other. He giggled once, surprising himself. Weeks later, he enrolled in engineering and found that math gave him a language that did not require adjectives. He drew wing sections as if forgiveness had a shape. Jack Torres's ship came home with a band and a banner and a silence between old shipmates that had to be filled with jokes for months before it could be filled with anything else. He caught a bus east and a subway to a neighborhood that smelled like laundry and garlic. He kissed his mother's cheek and it tasted like salt, because some salts are the same on any ocean. He stood at the East River and thought the current looked smug. He took a job on a tug for a while and decided that engines speaking in an honest tone are almost as good as prayers. He tried sitting in a college classroom and left after a week. He took night courses later and discovered he preferred questions that could be answered with a wrench. At a dance, he met a woman who laughed at a joke he had not meant to be funny, and he proposed 6 months later because life should sometimes be as simple as a bell. Robert Hale walked across a factory floor that had learned to be polite to itself again. Machines idling, fewer shifts, people moving without the urgent dignity of crisis. He met with his tool room and talked about washing machines for kitchens that would soon want to forget ration books, about refrigerators that would keep milk cold with quiet pride, about airplanes that would carry vacations rather than bombs. He wrote to a former procurement officer at the Navy and asked whether he might put an engineer in touch with a metallurgist to solve a problem in a civilian compressor. The answer came back in a week with a smiley line of handwriting he recognized. War teaches networks that peace then uses. He laid off fewer people than he had feared and more than he could forgive. He wrote letters of recommendation on company letterhead, and he meant every adjective. He spent a slow week rewriting the plant's emergency procedures in the past tense and filed them in a cabinet he labeled lessons, because he had learned to prefer nouns that do not pretend to finality. Anna Miller did not stop working when headlines changed font size. She opened new files with names that felt like breath: resettlement, reunification, claims, benefits. The GI Bill's paperwork had to be domesticated. She learned to treat it like a horse: firm voice, gentle hands, no sudden moves. Men and women came to her window with caps in hand and questions in eyes. She answered with rows and boxes and sometimes a private joke to remind them that laughter is a non-perishable. She wrote a memo recommending that letters to mothers of the missing include more than condolences. They should include phone numbers and a name that would answer the phone. Her supervisor approved it and later claimed credit for it. Anna shrugged and kept going. A sailor came to her desk one afternoon with a rumor that his benefits would be denied because he had been at sea too long and missed a filing deadline. She fixed the rumor, and he blessed her with a look he would remember when telling his grandchildren about how bureaucrats can be saints. Industry pivoted like a dancer with sore feet. War plants turned to cars and toasters, to tractors and measuring cups. Rubber plants kept making tires without ration cards. Aluminum, once stamped into wings, gleamed on the sides of trailers and on Venetian blinds that curtained optimism in suburbs rising out of cornfields. Housing went up in small units that looked like hope with siding. Levittowns with repeating streets, and kids who learned to pedal between neighbors with the trust of a nation that had decided it would like to be ordinary for a while. Unions renegotiated for peacetime priorities. Hours changed. Overtime lost its sheen. The phrase pent-up demand turned into lines at stores. Women who had wielded rivet guns looked at pink slips and made choices. Some fought to stay. Some left because they were tired. Some left because they were told to. Some left because a different kind of work. Raising the generation that would never understand ration books felt urgent. Each bent a life around the country's sudden decisions. In Geneva and San Francisco and London, men in suits and occasionally women in hats assembled to build a world that would not burn so easily. The United Nations didn't look like security at first. It looked like a dais and translators and a lot of draft language. Delegates tried to write the war's worst lessons into law: sovereignty paired with human rights, collective security paired with vetoes that would later paralyze and protect in alternating decades. Resolutions stacked like bricks, agencies formed with names that were almost lullabies: health, children, refugees, agriculture, acronyms that would later be used in both gratitude and complaint. A building rose on the East River, glass and conviction, and school children on tours were told not to run. The charter promised. It could not compel, it aspired, and aspiration is not nothing. The Cold War walked on stage before the applause from the last act died out. It entered with a suitcase labeled Alliances and one labeled Fear. In Berlin, a city that had once believed itself the center of the world, the policing of zones turned into a confrontation of systems. Air corridors became arteries. Bridges became props in a drama that now had a new vocabulary: blocks, curtains, deterrence. The Soviet entry against Japan closed one war and opened another spreadsheet. Names of governments in Eastern Europe under new management. Names of guerrilla movements in Greece fighting civil war with ghosts from old battles. Names of spies who had changed sides twice and planned to do so again. In Washington, briefings took on a new color. This time the maps were blue and red, and the arrows were theoretical, a kind of chess made from steel and ideology. In Moscow, the calculus was inverted but similarly obsessive. The weapon that ended the war over Japan became the centerpiece of a new equation: how to stop wars by threatening to make them end before they begin. How to do it without ending everything. Frank's first semester introduced him to courses with names he could say without feeling like he was showing off: American government, economics, composition. The GI Bill paid his tuition and his pride. In seminar he argued about unions, about housing, about the new international body with a logo that looked like a map inside a wreath. He dated a girl who liked the way he listened, not because he was quiet, but because he made silence feel like encouragement. He sat in class when a professor lectured about war aims and felt the difference between pages and mud. Once, in a hallway, he overheard a boy call the war inevitable, and surprised himself by laughing out loud in the way a man might laugh at a drunk explaining moderation. He learned to sleep without counting artillery. The percentage of nights when he woke to invisible noise declined slowly, then faster. He still checked the door twice every evening. Ben spent evenings in a lab where chalk dust made the air look like early morning fog. He planned aircraft that would fly for business people rather than bombs. And he did something else. He signed a petition about international control of atomic energy. He did not imagine he could stop anything. He wanted, like every good engineer, to specify tolerances and failure modes. How much power? How much oversight? What happens if? He dated a pianist who showed him that hands can speak without saying anything. He married her quietly, and they went on a road trip where the only schedule was the road. He learned to love a silence filled with wind and her laugh. He kept his goggles case on a shelf because talismans don't obey orders. Jack tried to join the Merchant Marine and then chose instead to take a city job with a badge. He liked the weight of responsibility when it came without shouting. He missed the ship and dreamed about ladders on a moving deck. He went to a union meeting in a church basement where coffee tasted like victory and resolution, and he voted for a contract that would guarantee paid leave because he knew what unpaid debt to a body felt like. He taught his son to swim and to look both ways and to tell the truth. He rarely talked about kamikaze except once, when a neighbor said the war was ancient history already, and Jack said, "It was last night." And then they both decided to watch a ball game. Robert's plant received a contract to make household appliances. He insisted that the instruction manuals be written at a reading level his mother would have approved of. He hired Sam Little to run quality assurance and smiled when Sam wrote a memo about how it was cheaper to fix a problem now than to pay for a reputation later. He talked to a reporter about the pivot to peace and found himself saying that war had taught him one lesson that mattered everywhere. Redundancy saves lives. He built redundancy into peacetime schedules. 2 suppliers, not one, cross-training, backup plans. When the factory whistle blew at 5 p.m., he listened for a sound he knew would never come again. The second whistle that had once meant emergency. He felt relieved and strangely lonely when it never blew. Anna attended a small ceremony for the new UN building and thought the river looked like it was trying to contain its excitement. She brought her niece, pointed at the flags, and said the sentence adults say when they hope it will be true. This will help. At work, she processed the first batch of GI mortgage applications that would turn soldiers into homeowners and potato fields into grid streets. She pushed for a line on forms that asked whether the applicant needed information in another language. She went on a date with a man who admired her efficiency. She didn't go on a second with him because he liked efficiency more than kindness. She eventually married a shy teacher who understood that a person can be both formidable and tender. She continued to file things under lessons and slept the sleep of the useful. Aiko left the government office for a job at a newspaper that needed someone who could read wire stories from Tokyo and explain them to editors who thought Asia was one place. She wrote an occasional column under a pen name about being from 2 countries at once and never fully belonging to either. She visited a resettlement office that helped families like hers find apartments, and she saw on the wall a photograph taken years earlier. A girl behind a fence smiling because children are experts at treason against. Despair. She held her breath and then let it go. She fell in love with a man who had been in the 442nd and who carried his own drawer of clippings in his heart. They made a small home. They kept a map on the wall and measured their peace in dinners with friends. The memory war began almost immediately. What should be remembered, and how, and by whom? Veterans groups formed and argued about monuments, angels or rifles or nothing. Towns built plaques with too few names, and then found more names scribbled in drawers and added them with a ceremony that made old men cry. Museums collected uniforms and doubts. Scholars wrote the first of many books and argued over adjectives. Was this campaign decisive, that one tragic, another avoidable? In Germany, a generation learned to look at photographs until their eyes hurt. Another generation tried not to look and then was forced to by teachers who believed in therapy via evidence. In Japan, narratives split and braided. Imperial victimhood and apology, pacifist pride and nationalist amnesia argued in newspapers and classrooms. In the United States, triumph and grief learned to share parades. Memorial Day found new rituals, and so did kitchen tables. The memory war would outlive the veterans because the past always recruits the living. The economy breathed out and then in. Inflation flirted with uprising, policies courted it, then tamed it. Europe begged for Marshall aid and then used it to rebuild with a fervor that surprised even the donors. Trains ran, then ran on time. Factories restarted and then retooled. Coal moved under places where children played marbles again. In Asia, civil wars marched under flags that had been in storage. Revolutions wrote their own scripts. Neighbors learned new words for border. Colonies cracked open. India took independence with an exhale of joy and an intake of agony. Indonesia declared. Vietnam argued with Paris in the language of rifles. Africa made lists, parties, newspapers, prisons, futures. Old empires counted ships and came up short. The bomb cast a long shadow with a short name. policymakers rehearsed variations on the same question: how to deter without detonating, how to control without denying, how to promise security without institutionalizing fear. Laboratories that had built lenses built reactors that would power cities. Protesters who had built posters would soon build movements that put the words ban and bomb on the same banner and sleep on university lawns. Scientists peeled away from classified projects and wrote papers that insisted on the dignity of curiosity. Others stayed and argued that engineers do not have the moral privilege of abstention. Exiles from Europe, who had lit fuses in 1939 because another kind of catastrophe cast its own shadow, looked at the new world with a sadness that did not prevent them from teaching undergraduates how to find joy in Maxwell's equations. The GI Bill remade more than individual lives. It remade neighborhoods and, over time, the country's spine. Working-class people who had never imagined college found themselves explaining Plato to parents who were delighted even when they were unconvinced. Suburban lawns sprouted beside new roads, and with them a new style of politics that combined contentment with suspicion of strangers. Not everyone was invited. The bill faced the usual biases that have always tried to reduce the number of chairs at the table. Some veterans, especially black veterans in the South, discovered that banks had ways to say no that were not strictly illegal yet. Lawsuits and anger followed. Over decades, the promise widened and the anger filtered into reforms in the handfuls common to democracy. War brides arrived on ships that smelled like salt and futures. Children learned their first words in accents that put old countries in new mouths. The cuisine of the country thickened. Pasta and soy sauce, curry and baguettes, all better handled by grandmothers who had never seen the inside of a restaurant kitchen and improved every recipe with love and audacity. Jazz found Paris. Cinema went to Rome. Literature wrote itself in Buenos Aires with echoes from Madrid and Brooklyn. The world's conversation, interrupted by artillery for 6 years, resumed with a voraciousness that made translation a growth industry. At home, the men who did not sleep easily found each other in VFW halls and in back rows at Catholic masses, and on the stoops where summer evenings invite confession. They learned a new game: how to tell stories that do not unsettle children and do not lie to themselves. Some succeeded, others did not try. Some drank, some gardened, some took up woodworking because wood speaks softly. Wives improvised therapies. Children learned early to read a mood by the set of a jaw. None of it showed up in indexes until much later. When doctors learned to say trauma without implying weakness, and when the country decided to admit that its soldiers are human before they are symbols. Across the oceans, the occupation matured into something with schools and sewage systems. In Japan, students read textbooks rewritten not to erase the past, but to remove its armor. Artists tested themes that had been forbidden and found that pain, when rendered honestly, is a powerful solvent. The Constitution's pacifism hardened into a political identity and softened into a practical compromise when ships needed coastguards and skies needed control. Elections produced cabinets who learned to manage a new vocabulary: security, alliance, trade, in a language that had not been used in quite that way before. American bases became neighbors in a way that only long wars ending in long peace can produce. Tea poured over fences, baseball traveled both directions. Misunderstandings were routine and mostly survivable. Europe's partitions solidified into lines that would last until another century had the nerve to erase them. West Germany discovered the engineering pride that would soon make its cars a world cliché. East Germany discovered that efficiency is not an ideology. Berlin practiced being two cities with one name. The bridge airlift arrived and departed, an epic of tonic water and chocolate bars, and proved that grand strategy can be measured in calories. In Italy, governments fell and rose as if the peninsula enjoyed motion for its own sake. In France, existentialists smoked and wrote sentences that made coffee taste like ideas. In Britain, maps were redder, then less so. The NHS opened clinics like chapels with stethoscopes. The continent learned to talk to itself in committees that would eventually become a union with arguments that looked domestic. The memory war sharpened like a blade, and then, as veterans aged, became less about accusation than about inheritance. Museums formalized, memorials multiplied. School trips made history into a field exercise. Scholars found new archives and discovered that the truth had receipts. Filmmakers tried to avoid glamour and failed and tried again. Poets did what poets do, made small boats out of words for people to ride across rivers they did not know they had in them. Each generation asked the one before it for permission to understand differently. Permission was granted reluctantly, then generously, then with relief. In a small apartment, Aiko kept a photograph of her parents in kimono beside a photograph of herself in a government office, typing under a portrait of a president. She finally threw away the envelope marked "Find" when she learned the family had resettled 3 states away and had sent her a holiday card with a snapshot of a child in a snowsuit. She smiled at the apparition of normalcy. She cooked rice on Sundays and pot roast on Wednesdays and read newspapers every morning and every night. Anna retired from a desk that had gathered an aura. People whispered that forms filled at her counter were blessed. She laughed and corrected them. She was just stubborn. She went to the library twice a week and wrote a small guide for new clerks about how to treat customers without becoming a doormat. It was copied until it became folklore in the office. At home, she watered plants and watched pigeons, and followed the UN's televised debates as if they were a soap opera with better diction. Sometimes she lost patience with diplomats and then remembered that impatience with diplomacy is nostalgia for war. Robert brought a box from the attic one spring. Inside were notebooks filled with production graphs and doodles of wing spars and notes to himself about leadership. He showed them to his grandson, who was 10 and bored in the middle, and fascinated at the end when Robert said, "Every line here is a person. Don't ever let numbers make you forget that." He closed the box and decided to speak at the high school on Veterans Day without saying glory or honor too many times. He decided to say, "We worked, we argued, we learned, we lost, we won, we paid, we owed." Ben taught at a university where students wanted to design rockets. He told them at the first lecture, "What you build carries people's lives inside it. Everything else is after." He held up his old goggles and said nothing, letting the room fill with quiet. He loved his wife in the ordinary ways that make marriage a marvel. Shared chores, shared jokes, shared grief when a friend died. He avoided air shows. He visited one once with his children, and the sound of a radial engine filled his chest the way a hymn fills a church, and he closed his eyes and said, "Thank you to no one in particular." Jack aged into his job with dignity. He learned names on his beat and knew which kids would want to be cops and which should become chefs. He refereed 6 marriages and 200 parking disputes. He kept a picture of his ship inside his locker and opened it when he needed to remind himself that crisis can be survived. He went fishing with his son and taught him how to listen to water, which is a skill most people never learn because cities are louder. Sometimes he woke at 4 a.m. and walked to the kitchen and drank water and looked out the window and remembered a horizon with danger in it, and then remembered he was safe. Frank graduated and found a job doing something he could explain at a dinner table without pausing. He married his listener. He had children who learned that their father took care of their bikes with the seriousness of a priest. He went to reunions and hugged men who had stood next to him under fog, and then snow, and then sunshine, and they avoided the topic of luck, and then spoke it plainly once a decade. He visited Italy once and stood in a square where he had once crouched behind a wall and couldn't reconcile the gelato with the memory of mortars. So he ate too and decided reconciliation is not a necessary step. The new order was not one thing, it was a collection of bets. Bet on education to make citizens who will detect demagogues earlier next time. Bet on international institutions to keep guns silent longer. Bet on prosperity to make war less tempting and more costly. Bet on memory to prevent repetition. Bet on deterrence to discipline temptation. Bet on generosity to defeat resentment. Not every bet paid. Enough did that the century did not explode again at once. It flickered and burned in places far from the parades. Korea, Algeria, the Congo, Hungary, Suez, Saigon, Prague, Tehran. The lessons from 1939 to 1945 whispered through all of them. Sometimes the whisper was heard, and sometimes it was ignored. And still, every morning, oceans behaved without permission. A boy in Normandy climbed on a seawall and threw a stick for a dog. A fisherman in Okinawa set out nets. A sailor aboard a carrier watched dawn turn steel into polished language. Memory lives in tides as much as in books. The world that rose out of the war woke each day to water, that did not care who had signed what, and yet reflected every flag that happened to fly over it. Years later, the threads of this story would knot in quieter rooms. Frank sat on a porch and peeled an apple with a knife the way his father had taught him, and watched a grandson roll a truck down a step. He thought about a hedge bank and a flag on a pole that had made him cry. He thought about a rapido river that had made him shake. He thought about a bridge that held. He did not think heroism belonged to him. He thought survival did, and he considered that a strange kind of fortune. Ben tuned a piano for his wife and discovered that ears trained to harmonics can forgive a great many other things. He hung his goggles in a museum because his daughter told him it would matter to someone else. He walked home afterward and took the long way, past an airfield where gliders lifted without engines, and his heart felt light, not heavy. Jack retired and found it hard to sit still. He volunteered at a maritime museum and told kids that ships are just neighborhoods that float. He showed them a compass and said, "This is the one thing on a ship that never lies." And he watched their eyes widen and hoped they would remember that some instruments still deserve trust. Robert planted tomatoes because production schedules cannot teach a man everything. He died with his hand on his wife's forearm, and at his funeral a line of machinists stood and told stories about managers who listened and how that is rarer than anyone thinks. Sam took over the plant for a time and then retired and wrote a book on quality control that college students read without knowing they were reading a biography of a decade. Anna wrote letters to the editor until she was 91 and used a fountain pen because cursive feels like a virtue. She corrected a television anchor in a polite note and received a handwritten thank you. She kept it under a magnet next to the memo about translators. Aiko lit a candle on August 6th each year and set it on her windowsill. Once, a neighbor asked her why. She said, "Because people are real." And the neighbor nodded, though she was not sure what that meant. And later, on another August 6th, she understood. And she nodded again when no one was watching. The last image cannot be a courtroom or a treaty or a factory floor. Those are rooms where people do necessary work. The last image must be the ocean at dawn because everything, at some point, returns to water. A grey line smudges into blue. The air has that smell only sailors know how to name, salt and cold metal and possibility. Somewhere a destroyer's bell rings, light as a coin in a pocket. A carrier's deck crew yawns and adjusts ear protectors. A cargo ship pushes past a buoy where cormorants dry their wings. On a beach in Normandy, the tide slides over sand it once stained, and children race it with squeals that make the present safe. On an Okinawan shore, a fisherman checks knots his father taught him to tie. Off Tokyo Bay, a ferry carries commuters whose grandparents were young when flags changed. The water doesn't absolve, it doesn't accuse, it reflects, it carries. It connects cities that burned and factories that hummed and farms that grew potatoes enough for a generation to stop being hungry. It remembers everything without speaking. The light strengthens. The horizon is less a line than a promise. The world built out of victory and loss wakes to another day, older and changed, and for a moment before the engines start, the ocean holds the quiet the century never had enough of.